Account of the Choctaw Nation by James Adair. The Choctaw country lies in about 33 and 34 degrees north latitude. According to the course of the Indian Path, their western lower towns are situated 200 computed miles to the northward of New Orleans, the upper ones 160 miles to the southward of the Choctaw Nation, 150 computed miles to the west of the late dangerous French Alabama garrison in the Muskogee country, and 150 to the north of Mobile, which is the first settlement, and only town, except New Orleans, that the French had in West Florida. Their country is pretty much in the form of an oblong square. The barrier towns, which are next to the Muskogee and Chickasaw countries, are compactly settled for social defense, according to the general method of other savage nations, but the rest, both in the center and toward the Mississippi, are only scattered plantations, as best suits a separate easy way of living. A stranger might be in the middle of one of their populous extensive towns, without seeing half a dozen of their houses in the direct course of his path. The French, to intimidate the English traders by the prodigious number of their red legions in West Florida, boasted that the Choctaw consisted of 9,000 men fit to bear arms, but we find the true amount of their numbers, since West Florida was ceded to us, to be not above half as many as the French report ascertained. And, indeed, if the French and Spanish writers of the American Aborigines had kept so near the truth as to mix one half of realities with their flourishing wild hyperboles, the literati would have owed them more thanks than is now their due. Those who know the Choctaw will firmly agree in opinion with the French concerning them that they are in the highest degree of a base, ungrateful, and thievish disposition, fickle and treacherous, ready-witted, and endued with a surprising flow of smooth, artful language on every subject, within the reach of their ideas, and each of these qualities they far exceed any society of people I ever saw. They are such great proficients in the art of stealing that in our storehouses they often thieve while they are speaking to and looking the owner in the face. It is reckoned a shame to be detected in the act of theft, but it is the reward they receive which makes it shameful, for, in such a case, the traitor bastinadoes the covetous sinner almost as long as he seems sensible of pain. A few years ago, one of the Chickasaw warriors told me he heard a middle-aged Choctaw warrior boast in his own country, at a public ball play, of having artfully stolen several things from one and another trader, to a considerable amount, while he was cheapening goods of us, and we were blind in our own houses. As their country is pleasantly interspersed with hills, and generally abounds with springs and creeks, or small brooks, and is in a happy climate, it is extremely healthful. Having no rivers in their country, few of them can swim, like other Indians, which often proves hurtful to them when high freshes come on while they are out at war. Their towns are settled on small streams that purl into Mobile River, and another a little to the southward of it. Coosa, the largest town in their nation, lies within 180 miles of Mobile, at a small distance from the river which glides by that low and unhealthy old capital. The summer breezes pass by Mobile in two opposite directions along the channel of the river, and very unhealthy vapors keep floating over the small semicircular opening of the town, which is on the south side of the river, opposite to a very low marsh that was formed by great torrents of water, sweeping down rafts of fallen trees till they settled there and were mixed with the black soil of the lowlands, carried and subsiding there in a like manner. From thence, to the opposite shore, the river hath a sandy bottom, and at low water is so very shallow that a person could almost walk across, though it is 2 leagues broad. The southern side of the river is so full of great trees that sloops and schooners have considerable difficulty in getting up abreast, and for a considerable distance from the sea coast, the land is low and generally unfit for planting, even on the banks of the river. About 40 miles up, the French had a small settlement of 1 plantation deep from the bank of Mobile River. The rest of the land is sandy pine barrens, till within 40 miles of the Choctaw country, where the oak and the hickory trees first appear, from whence it is generally very fertile, for the extensive space of about 600 miles toward the north, and in some places 250, in others 260 in breadth, from the Mississippi. This tract far exceeds the best land I ever saw besides in the extensive American world. It is not only capable of yielding the various produce of all our North American colonies on the main continent as it runs from the south towards the north, but, likewise, many other valuable commodities which their situation will never allow them to raise. From the small rivers which run through this valuable large tract, the far-extending ramifications are innumerable, each abounding with evergreen canes and reeds, which are as good to raise cattle in winter as the best hay in the northern colonies. I need not mention the goodness of the summer ranges, for, where the land is good, it always produces various sorts of good timber, such as oak of different kinds, hickory, walnut, and poplar trees. The grass is commonly as long and tender as what the best English meadows yield, and, if those vacant fertile lands of the Mississippi were settled by the remote inhabitants of Virginia, the Ohio, and North Carolina, they, from a small stock, could in a few years raise a prodigious number of horses, horned cattle, sheep, and swine, without any more trouble than branding, marking, and keeping them tame, and destroying the beasts of prey, by hunting them with dogs, and shooting them from the trees. Soon they might raise abundance of valuable productions, as would both enrich themselves and their offspring, and, at the same time, add in a very high degree to the naval trade and manufactures of Great Britain. The Choctaw flatten their foreheads with a bag of sand, which with great care they keep fastened on the skull of the infant, while it is in its tender and imperfect state. Thus they quite deform their face, and give themselves an appearance, which is disagreeable to any but those of their own likeness. Their features and mind, indeed, exactly correspond together, for, except the intense love they bear to their native country, and their utter contempt of any kind of danger, in defense of it, I know no other virtue they are possessed of. The general observation of the traders among them is just, who affirm them to be divested of every property of a human being, except shape and language. Though the French at Mobile, and some at New Orleans, could speak the Choctaw language extremely well, and consequently guide them much better than the English, notwithstanding we gave them a far greater supply of every kind of goods than they could purchase, yet the French allowed none of them arms and ammunition, except such who went to war against our Chickasaw friends. One of those outstanding companies was composed also of several towns, for usually one town had not more than from 5 to 7 guns. When the owners, therefore, had hunted one moon, they lent them for hire to others, for the like space of time, which was the reason that their deer skins, by being chiefly killed out of season, were then much lighter than now. The French commandant of Tumbuck garrison supervised the trade, as none was ever chosen to preside in so critical a place, unless well and early acquainted in the dialect, manners, and customs of the savages. The French Indian garrisons consisted of chosen provincial families, who had not the least spark of that haughty pride and contempt, which is too often predominant, at least among the ignorant part of the soldiery, against all, except their own fraternity. The Choctaw were known to be of so fickle, treacherous, and bloody a disposition, that only 3 or 4 peddlers were allowed to go among them at a time. When they returned to the fort, the same number went out again, with as many trifles as a small barrel would conveniently contain. Thus they continued to amuse the savages of low rank, but they always kept the headmen in pay. These, at every public meeting and convenient occasion, gave stated energetic orations in praise of the French, and, by this means, the rest were influenced. The peddlers thus got almost what they were pleased to ask, in return for their worthless trifles. All the way up the numerous streams of the Mississippi, and down those of Canada River, their wisdom directed them to keep up the price of their goods, and, by that means, they retained the savages in the firmest amity with them. No traitor was allowed among them, except those of sufficient skill in that dangerous sphere of life, and of faithful principles to government. The French very justly say, the English spoil the savages, wherever their trade extends among them. They were too wise ever to corrupt them, according to our modern mad schemes. They had 2 great annual marts, where the Indians came to traffic for their deerskins, beaver, and peltry, the one at Montreal, and the other at the Illinois, under the cannon of those garrisons. But the Philadelphians, in order to engross the trade of the latter place, by a foolish notion of underselling the old French traders, have ruined, and, as I am lately informed, entirely discontinued it. They who speak so much in favor of lowering the Indian trade ought first to civilize the savages and convince them of the absolute necessity there is of selling the same sort of goods at various prices according to different circumstances, exceedingly enhanced by the external kindly behavior and well-adapted smooth address of the giver. But our wise men in this department bestow the presence of the government too often in such a manner as to rivet the contempt they have imbibed against us, for I have been frequently upbraided, even by the old friendly Chickasaw, when inebriated, that the English, in general, despised their friends, and were kindest to those who most insulted and injured them, and that the surest way for the red people to get plenty of presents was not to deserve them, but to act the murdering part of the ill-hearted Muskogee. In confirmation of their strong invectives, they recited above 70 instances of the Muskogee having murdered the English, not only with impunity, but with silent approbation, as they soon afterward received large presents, which must be either as a due for the bloodshed or tribute given through fear. They enumerated some facts, which were attended with shocking circumstances, as an innocent mother of good report, and 2 of her little children, put to slow torture in boiling water, and several of the like nature, which the Muskogee themselves had informed them of in a way of boasting, and to induce them to imitate their mischievous, but profitable example. While we bear any cool premeditated acts of Indian hostility with that crouching base behavior, such passive conduct will serve only to tempt the Indians to advance in their favorite science of blood and commence a general war. For cowards, they always insult and despise, and will go any distance to revenge the blood of one of their tribe, even that of an old woman. As it was confidently reported that a military government would be continued by us in West Florida till it was thick settled, the French inhabitants, imagining that event could not happen till doomsday, mostly retired to New Orleans in order to shun such a tyrannic police. They were afraid of being imprisoned and whipped at the governor's caprice, and even for things unnoticeable in the eye of the law, for as he ruled imperial over the soldiery, he would expect all his orders to be readily obeyed by every other person, without any hesitation. Such things are too common in a military government, and it was fatally experienced in this. In order to establish his absolute power, as the merchants and other gentlemen at Mobile, of generous principles, despised it, he found a plea to contend with one of them, though it was both illegal and entirely out of his element. A Choctaw, having bought a small brass kettle of one of the principal merchants of that place, was persuaded by a Frenchman to return it, bring the value to him, and he would give him a better one in its stead, for there happened to be a very small crack of no consequence, and scarcely discernible, just above the rim. The Indian accordingly went to return it, but the gentleman would not receive it, as it was good, and fairly sold at the usual price. The Choctaw went back to the Frenchman to excuse himself in not being able to deal with him, as proposed, who persuaded him to complain to the governor of the pretended injustice he had received from the merchant. He did, and the ruler gladly embraced the opportunity to gratify his pride and aggrandize his power. He immediately sent some of his underlings, with a positive verbal command to the gentleman, to cancel the bargain with the Choctaw, and deliver to him what he claimed. On receiving his own, the free-born Briton excused his non-compliance, in a rational and polite manner, according to his constant easy behavior. Upon this, like a petty tyrant, the chief sent a file of musketeers for him. When he appeared before his greatness, he asserted the common privileges of a trading-free subject of Great Britain with decent firmness, and set forth the ill consequences of giving the troublesome savages an example so hurtful to trade, with other arguments well adapted to the occasion. The return was an order to thrust the gentleman into the black hole of the garrison, where he was detained and treated as a capital criminal, till, by the loss of health through the dampness of that horrid place, the love of life prompted him to comply with every demand. Had he waited the award of a court-martial, probably he would have had justice done him, for, except a couple of the officers of the commander's own principles, all the rest blamed, if not despised him for his haughtiness and ungenerous principles. This is a genuine sample of military governments. The Canadians may expect many such instances of justice and humanity in consequence of the late Quebec Act, if it be not repealed. While this military man acted in the magisterial office, though in pain when not triumphing over those peaceable subjects who would not stoop before him below the character of freeman, to flatter his lordly ambition, yet it was affirmed, he could not stand the sight of the inebriated Choctaw. One instance of his passive conduct toward them deserves to be recorded, as the sentinels at the gates of his house were strictly ordered not to resist the savages. These soon became so impudent as to insult them at pleasure, and one of them, without the least provocation, struck a soldier, while on his duty standing sentry, with a full bottle on his head, with that violence as to break his skull. The unfortunate soldier languished, and died, by the blow, without the least retaliation, though so absolutely needful in our early state of settling that part of the continent. We well know the fate of the British Americans in general, as to property, liberty, and life, if their court enemies could but metamorphose them into asses, and quietly impose upon them military men as governors and magistrates, to enforce a strict obedience to their grasping hand and boundless will. But may our wise statesmen henceforth rather keep them at home, and place them over such mean spirits as have sold their birthrights for a mess of pottage, and are degenerated from every virtue of the true and brave Englishman. Though the French Americans were as desirous of purchasing Indian deerskins and beaver as the English could well be, yet they wisely declined, where the public peace and security required it. By their wisdom, they employed the savages, as occasion offered, and kept them entirely dependent. They distributed through each nation a considerable number of medals and flourishing commissions, in a very artful gradation, so as to gratify their proud tempers, and obtain an universal sway over them. They also sent a gunsmith to each of their countries, to mend the locks of their guns, at the expense of government, and any warrior who brought his chieftain's medal as a certificate was waited on, and sent off with honor, and a very bon grace, to his entire satisfaction. With this, and other instances of good conduct, they led the savages at pleasure. When the French evacuated the Alabama garrison, the Muskogee despitefully objected against receiving any such favors from us. Even our old friendly Chickasaw were only tantalized with our friendship on that occasion, for the gunsmith was recalled, which, joined with the rest of the bad conduct of our managers of Indian affairs, vexed them so exceedingly that they were on the point of committing hostilities against us in the year 1769. So widely different is our Indian trading conduct from that of the French. They wisely preferred the security of their valuable but weak country to the dangerous profits of trade. They kept the best orators and the headmen as pensioners on their side, and employed the rest of the warriors in their favorite science against the Chickasaw. As with the high-placed mercenaries in Great Britain, so it will be a very difficult task, for some time, to manage any of the Indians well, particularly the Choctaw, unless they in some manner receive a favored bribe, under the name of presents, as they usually had from the French. By reason of our misconduct, and the foolish distribution of presents, since Florida was ceded to us, they have been twice on the point of breaking with us, though the managers of our Indian affairs were at the same time echoing in the public papers of Georgia and South Carolina the peaceable and friendly disposition of all the savage nations around the colonies. The Choctaw were designed to strike the first blow on their traders, and immediately to follow it on the inhabitants of Mobile, which, they imagined, they could easily effect by surprise in the night, and so enrich themselves with an immense booty. The first of those bloody plans was concerted against us, October the 18th, 1765. The cause of which I shall relate. In the eastern part of the Choctaw Nation, there is a young and very enterprising war leader, called the Tory Pine Chieftain, or the leader of the Land Tortoise family. His ambitious temper, which one of the traders at first imprudently supported against our old friendly war chieftain, Pyamataha, has unhappily divided the nation into two parties, which frequently act in opposition to any salutary measure, which is either proposed or pursued by the other. The Tory Pine chief received an embassy from the Muskogee Great Mortar to engage him against us, through a false pretense that we intended to take their lands, and captivate their women and children, as the vast strides we lately made through that extensive tract, from Georgia to New Orleans, and up the Mississippi, all the way to the Illinois, he said, would clearly convince so wise a people. He exhorted the Choctaw war leaders and old beloved men to rouse their martial tempers to defend their liberty and property, and preserve their holy places and holy things from the ambitious views of the impure and covetous English people, to listen to the loud call of liberty, and join heart and hand in its generous defense, which they now could easily effect by crushing the snake in its infant state, whereas delay would allow it time to collect strength, to the utter danger of everything they held as valuable, that now was the time to avert those dangerous evils, and that their mutual safety was at stake. He assured them from repeated experience that the very worst that could befall home. They told our traders that His Excellency's speech was quite different to that of the beloved white man, meaning the superintendent, for it was very sharp and wounding, and that his eyes spoke, and glanced the fire also which was burning in his heart. No people are more observant of the passions in the honest face than they. Their eyes and judgment are surprisingly piercing, and in consequence of this governor's open, steady, virtuous conduct, all our neighboring nations honor and love him to this very day. The Chickasaw chief sent his bloody embassy to the Choctaw by a cunning and trusty uncle, who accompanied me to the late Tumbic fort. I was ignorant of the mischievous plan, till we arrived at camp, near the great red captain's. There, in bed at night, I plainly overheard the whole, and saw the white swan's wings, and others painted red and black, persuasive and speaking emblems of friendship to the one party, and war, blood, and death to the other. They received those base tokens, according to the mischievous intention of those who sent them. As they are fond of novelty, the news was conveyed through the nation, with profound secrecy. Besides, they were very much rejoiced at so favorable an opportunity of making peace with the Muskogee, who awed them exceedingly, on account of their repeated losses, which were chiefly occasioned by their want of skill in swimming. Tumbic garrison, a little before this time, was very unwisely removed, but, to supply that wrong measure, our superintendent of Indian affairs stationed here one of his representatives. He was as much unacquainted with the language, manners, and customs of the Indians as his employer, and yet wrote a considerable volume how to regulate Indian affairs in general, and particularly in the Choctaw country. Besides his want of proper qualifications in so nice and difficult an office, he was in his temper so turbulent, proud, and querulous that his presence, instead of quieting the savages, was more than sufficient to disoblige and distract them in the most friendly times. He lived in the deserted garrison as a place of security, kept weighty pulleys to the gates, and his own door shut, as if the place had been a monastery, which was the worst measure he could possibly have pursued, considering the proud and familiar temper of those he had to deal with, and the late soothing treatment of the French to them. Captain Ihama Akito, the great red captain, sent word to him he would call there, on a certain day, to confer with him on some material business. On account of their fluctuating counsels in so weighty an affair as the intended war, he prolonged the time of going there. For the space of 8 days, the gentleman engaged me to stay till the affair was decided. I continued without the least reluctance, as I saw the black storm gathering, and hoped I might be able in some measure to dispel it. When the red captain came, his chief business was to demand presents. In the same manner they received them from the French, as the war chiefs and beloved men were grown very poor, and to know whether our government would enable them to revenge their dead, by bestowing on them ammunition to continue the war against the Muskogee, who highly despised us, and frequently committed acts of hostility against our people. Contrary to my advice, he gave a plain negative to each of his queries, without considering contingencies, because the neighboring town was silent, and very few of them came near the fort. He flattered himself that those dangerous tokens proceeded entirely from the cold reception and frequent denials he had given them, and that for the future he could live there in a retired and easy manner. But had he taken the trouble to go among them, as I did, he might have seen by their gloomy faces what bitter rancor was in their hearts. Next day, I discovered at the most unfrequented part of the fort, which was near the southeast corner, on the riverside, that the wary savages had in the night-time forced 2 of the great posts so far apart as one person could easily pass through at a time. As such ocular proof might have made my host uneasy, I thought it wrong to molest his tranquility by the discovery. The Red Chief would now drink no spirituous liquors, though I pressed him to it. They know their weakness then, which might lead them to divulge their country's secrets, a great disgrace to a warrior. He went home with his heart greatly inebriated, however, on account of the flat denials he had received, especially as the warriors would depreciate him for his ill success. And a few days after, I set off with my red companion and lay all night at the red captain's house, which stands in one of the northern barrier towns. He walked out with me in the evening, but in his discourse he used as much evasion and craft as an old fox in his intricate windings to beguile the earnest pursuers. At night his house was very quiet, as if their long heads and treacherous hearts were equally at rest, but I plainly saw into their favorite and labored plan, and one of their females told me there was at that time a great many headmen of different towns at a neighboring house, conferring together concerning the white people, and that she believed their speech was not good, as they did not allow any women or boys to hear it. The Red Chief and I parted like courtiers. It soon began to rain, so as to swell the waters to such a considerable height as rendered them unpassable to horsemen whose circumstances were not quite desperate. The Choctaw leader sent a sprightly young man, his nephew, with me, under pretense of accompanying me and the above-mentioned Chickasaw warrior, but I was not without strong suspicion that he was sent to shoot me by surprise as soon as he heard the whooping death signal in pursuit of me. For they had sent runners to call home those who were hunting in the woods, and the last company of them we met, reaching our camp in the night, stayed there till the morning. We conversed together without the least disguise. They were confident the traitors were killed, and their favorite war and death cry would soon reach their listening ears. I thought it improper to make a jest of so serious an affair, and determined to set off, though my red companions endeavored to delay me as much as they could. Early in the morning, I took out my saddle, which the Choctaw mentioned to the others through a suspicion I intended to make my escape, but they quieted his jealousy by telling him I did so only because I was lazy to walk. About half a mile from camp, I soon caught and mounted one of my horses and set off, keeping clear of the trading path for about 4 miles, in order to perplex any pursuers that might be sent after me. When my horse tired, I led it on foot through the pathless woods about 50 miles, and heard no more of them. Had the Choctaw known how to obtain a sufficient supply of ammunition, they would at this very time have commenced war against us. That only checked their bloody aim, to their unspeakable grief, and prevented our being engaged in a dangerous war. All our Indian traders well know that the misconduct and obstinacy of the first superintendent of Indian affairs was the sole occasion of irritating the great Mortar to become bitter-hearted against us, and devoting himself with a bloodthirsty desire to injure us wherever his black policy could reach. And as the first, by his stiff behavior set on the Mortar, his successor, by ill-timed presence instead of demanding satisfaction, gave him as good an opportunity as he could have desired to impress the warriors of his own and other nations with a strong opinion of our timid disposition and incapacity of opposing them. The impression of Governor Johnstone's speech plainly declares they would not have been so weak as to utter their base threats against us to the Chickasaw leader at Pensacola, only that they were previously corrupted by the mismanagement of Indian affairs. I am well assured they frequently applauded his martial conduct when they returned home, and said he was a man and a warrior, which is as great an encomium as they can bestow on any mortal. May West Florida and New Georgiana on the extensive and fertile lands of the meandering Mississippi have a continual succession of such chief magistrates as Mr. Johnstone and his worthy successor Montford Brown, Esq., to study and promote the public good, and cause the balance of justice to be held with an even hand. The following relation will serve to display what should be our manner of treating the Indians. A white man, on Mobile River, sold spirituous liquors to a couple of the Choctaw, till they were much intoxicated and unable to purchase any more. He then strenuously denied to credit them, their usual burning thirst exciting them to drink more. They became too troublesome for any spirited person to bear with. He took up an axe, at first in his own defense, but when they endeavored to run off, he, in the heat of passion, pursued, and unhappily killed one of them. The other ran, and told his relations the sad disaster. Presently, nothing could be heard through the nation but heavy murmurs and sharp threats. Governor Johnstone had the murderers soon apprehended, and confined him to be tried in due course of law. This delay of executing justice on one, and whom we only secured from their resentment as they imagined, tempted them to think on a general massacre. Soon after the sitting of the general court, their revengeful hearts became easy, for the man was fairly tried and condemned because he did not kill the savage in his own defense, but while he was retreating from him. I have reason to believe the Indians would not have allowed the French, when in garrison among them, to delay shooting any of their people whom they but even suspected of having killed the meanest of their kindred, for, in the year 1740, the Muskogee, on a false suspicion, forced the commanding officer of the Alabama garrison, by their loud threats, to kill one of the militia soldiers. When they were leading him to the place of execution, he requested the favor of a bottle of wine, to enable him to die with the firm constancy of an honest French warrior. He received, and drank it off, though he pressed him with manly earnestness, and protested that he would gladly confine him, were it not contrary to the tenor of his commission. The savage, having boasted a while after his triumphal entrance, returned exultingly to his countrymen, to the shame and regret of the traitors. Our white beloved man thought himself best employed in other affairs than these, and doubtless, profitable family jobs ought to be well-minded. His successor was equally skillful in managing the Indians as himself, though much his inferior. His only merit was the having been a clerk to the Chickasaw white beloved man, who resigned his place on account of the discontinuance of his British pay. He corrupted and practiced with the Indians, according to the system his teacher pursued. One instance, among many, will show this. A gentleman came to view the Mississippi lands, from the settlements which are on the Yadkin, a large and beautiful river, that, after gliding down 300 miles to the Sandhill, Wilmington, and the West Brunswick, is styled Cape Fear River. He was highly pleased with the soil, climate, and situation of the lands he came in quest of, but told me, in a humorous manner, that, when he was at a French man's house, on the Spanish side of the river, a very lusty Choctaw called there, in company with others, upon a hunt. As the French Choctaw was desirous of ingratiating himself into the favor of the host, he began to ridicule my friend with gestures and mocking language. The more civilly the Englishman behaved, so much the more impudently the savage treated him. At length, his passions were inflamed, and he suddenly seized him in his arms, carried him a few steps off, and threw him down the bank into the Mississippi. The laugh now turned against him loud, for, if the Indians saw their grandmother break her neck by a fall from a horse, or any other accident, they would whoop and halloo. The Baptist, or dipped person, came out ashamed, but appeared to be very good-humored after his purification, as he found he had not one of the French woodpeckers to deal with. However, one night, when the gentleman was on his return, the savages pursued, and endeavored to kill him, and did seize his horses and baggage. He had a narrow escape for his life before he came to Quanchito, where the townspeople of the late great Red Shoes had settled, and our white beloved man resided. He made his complaint to him, which might have been expected to produce both pity and justice in any heart that was not callous. But, instead of endeavoring to redress his grievance, which he could have easily effected, he aggravated his sufferings by abuse. As the savage had been brought up with the English traders, so as to be called the boy of one of them, and lived in Yashu, the town of the present Red Shoes, our chief could easily have had everything returned, had he only demanded it in form. But, like his predecessor, he endeavored to keep in with the Indians. He deemed their favorable report of his friendly conduct toward them to be the main point he ought to observe, in order to secure the embassy from suffering damage, whatever became of truth or justice. The Choctaw have a remote, but considerable town, called Yaoan, which is the name of a worm that is very destructive to corn in a wet season. It lies 40 miles below the 7 southernmost towns of the nation, toward Mobile, and 120 computed miles from thence, on a pleasant small river that runs south of the town. As it is a remote barrier, it is greatly harassed by the Muskogee, when at war with them. Here, a company of them came lately looking for prey, but missing it, as the Choctaw were apprised, and stayed at home, their pride and disappointment excited them to injure those strangers who chanced to fall in their way. About 6 miles below the town, they came to the camp of 2 white men, who were just ready to set off to Mobile, with loaded horses. Being resolved not entirely to miss their errand of blood and plunder, they attacked them with their tomahawks, cautious of not alarming the neighboring enemy by the report of their guns. They speedily dispatched one of them, but the other, being strong-bodied, very fiery, and desperate, held them a sharp struggle. As it appeared afterward, his gun was found much battered, and the long grass quite beat down for a considerable way round the place where the Yaoan Indians found him suspended in the air. For as soon as those savages perpetrated that diabolical act, they hanged each of them on trees, with the horses' halters, and carried away 6 of the horses loaded with dressed deerskins, as far as Mobile River. Mingo Hama Akito, the great red chieftain of the aforesaid town, on his return from war with the Muskogee, fortunately intercepted them, killed and scalped 2, and retook the horses and leather. These he sent home, as he imagined the owner then resided in the nation, and would gladly redeem them with reasonable presents, while he went down to Mobile to show his trophies of war, in full hopes of getting a new supply of ammunition from the deputy superintendent, to be used against the common enemy. He flattered himself that the scalps brought into our maritime town, in solemn triumph, would prove a gladsome sight to our people, and enlarge their hearts towards him and his fatigued poor warriors. But he perceived nothing of this kind, of which he complained to me with very sharp language, and returned home, highly incensed against his New English friends. I have reason to remember this too well, for, a little after those white men were murdered, business calling me to Mobile by myself, I chose to decline the eastern path, and the middle one that leads by the Chakshuma old fields, as they were much exposed to the incursions of the Muskogee, and rode through the chief towns of the nation, along the horse path that runs from the Chicasa, nearest the Mississippi, to Mobile. About 6 miles below the 7 towns that lie close together, and next to New Orleans, I met a considerable party of the leaders and head warriors returning home from war. We shook hands together, and they seemed very glad to see me. They earnestly dissuaded me from proceeding any further, advised me to return 319 to their friendly town, and rest a while among them, declaring that if my ears were mad, and would not hear their friendly speech, I should surely be killed. The enemy were ranging the woods so very thick. They were good judges of the danger, as they knew the treacherous plan they had concerted together at Yaoan. But the memory of past times moved them to give me that kindly caution. I thanked them, and said, I wished business allowed me to act according to their advice, and accept of their generous invitation, but it did not. However, if my limited days were not finished before, I would shortly have the pleasure to see them again. I proceeded, and met several parties of the same main company, several miles distant from each other, carrying small pieces of a scalp, singing the triumphal song, and sounding the shrill death whoop, as if they had killed hundreds. On my resting and smoking with the last party, they informed me that their camp consisted of 250 warriors, under great leaders, who were then returning from war against a town of the Cusat Indians, who had settled 25 miles above Mobile, on the eastern side of the river, that they had killed and wounded several of them, suspecting them of abetting the Muskogee, and fortunately got one of their scalps, which the warriors of separate towns divided, and were carrying home, with joyful hearts. A stranger would be much surprised to see the boasting parade these savages made with one scalp of a reputed enemy. To appearance, more than 1,000 men, women, lusty boys, and girls went loaded with provisions to meet them, and to dance, sing, and rejoice at this camp for their success in war and safe return. Their camps were made with the green bark and boughs of trees, and gave a striking picture of the easy and simple modes of early ages. Their chieftains and great warriors sat in state, with the assuming greatness of the ancient senators of imperial Rome. I had the honor to sit a while with them, and was diverted with the old circling and wheeling dances of the young men and women. I smoked with them, and then took my leave of this last camp of rejoicing heroes. The Choctaw are the most formal in their addresses of all the Indian nations I am acquainted with, and they reckon the neglect of observing their usual ceremonies proceeds from contempt in the traders, and from ignorance in strangers. I encamped early, and within 2 leagues of Yaoan, as it seemed to be a good place for killing wild game. I imagined also that here the people were awed by the Muskogee from ranging the woods, but it happened otherwise, for, soon after the horse bells began to ring, 2 sprightly young fellows came through the cane swamp, and as enemies, they crawled up the steep bank of the creek, near to me, before I discovered them. My firearms were close at hand, and I instantly stood on my guard. They looked earnestly around to see for the rest of my company, as it is very unusual for any of the traders to take that journey alone. I asked them who they were, from whence they came, and what they were so earnestly searching for. They evaded answering my queries and asked me if I did not come by myself. I told them, without hesitation, that some way behind, my companion rode out of the path to kill deer, as his gun was good, and he could use it extremely well. On this, they spoke a little together, with a low voice, and then told me that they belonged to Yaoan and were part of a hunting camp, which was near at hand, and in view of the path. I asked them to sit down, which they did, but their discourse was disagreeable, as my supposed fellow traveler was the chief subject of it. They said they would go back to their camp. In this uneasy and restless manner, we continued till sunset, when one of them artfully got between me and my arms. Then they ordered me to stop the bells of my horses, which were grazing near the camp, used partly on account of the number of big flies that infest the country. I asked them the reason. They told me, because the noise frightened away the deer. I took no notice at first of their haughty command, but they repeated it with spiteful vehemence, and I was forced to obey their mandate. They looked and listened earnestly along the edge of the swamp, but being disappointed of their expected additional prey, in about the space of 10 minutes they ordered me to open the bells again. Of the manifold dangers I ever was in, I deemed this by far the greatest, for I stood quite defenseless. Their language and behavior plainly declared their mischievous designs. I expected every minute to have been shot down, and though I endeavored to show a manly aspect, the cold sweat trickled down my face through uneasiness and a crowd of contrary passions. After some time, in this alarming situation, they told me the ugly white man stayed long, and that they would go to their camp a little while, and return again. They did as they said. To deceive them, I had made my bed as for two people, of softened bear and buffalo skins, with the long hair and wool on, and blankets. My two watchmen came the third time, accompanied with one older than themselves. He spoke little, was artful, and very designing. They seemed much concerned at the absence of my supposed companion, lest he should by unlucky mischance be bewildered or killed by the Muskogee. I gave them several reasons to show the futility of their kindly fears, and assured them he usually stayed late to barbecue the meat when he killed much, as he could not otherwise bring it to camp, but that he never failed, on such an occasion, to come sometime in the night. The cunning fox now and then asked me a steady short question, in the way of cross-examination, concerning the main point they had in view, and my answers were so cool and uniform that I almost persuaded them firmly to credit all I said. When he could no way trepand me, and there was silence for several minutes, he asked me if I was not afraid to be at camp alone. I told him I was an English warrior, my heart was honest, and as I spoiled nobody, why should I be afraid? Their longing eyes by this time were quite tired. The oldest of them very politely took his leave of me in French, and the others, through an earnest friendly desire of smoking, and chatting a little with my absent companion, told me at parting to be sure to call them, by sounding the news whoop, as soon as he arrived at camp. I readily promised to comply, for the sake of the favor of their good company, and to prevent any suspicion of the truth of my tale. I added that if he failed in his usual good luck, they ought to supply us with a leg of venison, or we would give them as much, if he succeeded. And now all was well, at least, with me, for I took time by the forelock, and left them to echo the news whoop. Yaoan lay nearly southeast from me, but to avoid my being either intercepted on the path, or heard by the quick-eared savages, I went a quarter of a mile up the large cane swamp, and passed through it on a southwest course, but very slow, as it was a dark thicket of great canes and vines, overtopped with large spreading trees. I seldom had a glimpse of any star to direct my course, the moon being then far spent. About an hour before daylight, I heard them from the top of an high hill fire off a gun at camp, which I supposed was when they found me gone, and in order to decoy my supposed companion to answer them with the like report, conjecturing he would imagine it was I who fired for him, according to custom in similar cases. I kept nearly at the distance of 3 miles from the path, till I arrived at the outhouses of Yaoan. As I had never before seen that town, nor gone to Mobile that way, One of the warriors at my request conducted me to the river, which we waded breast-high, and went to the palisadoed fort of Mingo Hama Equito, which stood commodiously on the bank of the river. He received and treated me very kindly. I concealed what befell me at camp, though I had reason to believe he was informed of my escape by a runner, as I saw fresh tracks when I returned. I pretended to have come from camp, only to confer with him concerning the situation of Mobile Path, and follow his advice either to proceed on or return home, being convinced so great a chieftain as he, who lived in defiance of the Muskogee on that remote barrier, must be a better judge than any of those I had met. He commended me for my caution, and assured me there were several companies of the Muskogee then out at war on the path, and that as they hated and despised the English, they would surely kill me if I continued my journey. I thanked him for his friendly caution, and told him it should not fall to the ground. I soon discovered his great resentment against the English on account of the impolitic and unkind treatment he had received at Mobile. He reasoned upon it with strong natural good sense, and showed me in his museum the 2 red-painted scalps of the Muskogee who had murdered our people, and left them in contempt hanging like mangy dogs, with a horse's rope round each of their necks. He then showed me the flourishing commissions he had received from both French and English. He descanted minutely on the wise and generous liberality of the former on every material occasion, and on the niggardly disposition and discouraging conduct of the latter, when they ought to stretch out both their hands to those red people who avenged their wrongs, and brought them the scalps of the very enemy who had lately shed their blood. The French never so starved the public cause, and though they frequently gave sparingly, they bestowed their favors with a winning grace and consummate wisdom. This conduct of ours excited the crafty Mingo Hama Equito to give loose to his vindictive temper, and at the same time to make it coincide with the general welfare of his country. For as the Muskogee had proved an overmatch for them in almost every engagement, and had lately committed hostilities against us in their neighborhood, he persuaded those headmen I had met, when convened in a council of war, that if they with proper secrecy repeated the like hostile act on any of our people who first came that way, and reported it to have been done by the Muskogee, it would certainly obtain that favorite point they had long wished for, of drawing us into an alliance with them against the common enemy, as we must have some of the inward feelings of men for our lost people. Probably, the decree of that Red Council would have been soon put in execution had it not been for me. When I took my leave of the Red Chief to return, the drum was beat to convene the people to tell them the cause of my coming to him, and returning home, and that as the women and children had seen me in the town, their late plan of execution must be entirely laid aside. One of the warriors was sent to accompany me, though rather by way of escortment. In my return, I called at the before-mentioned camp, and put up the whoop. My 2 former watchmen, on seeing me, resembled wolves catched in a pit. They hung down their heads, and looked gloomy and wrathful. I asked them why they were ashamed, and why their hearts weighed so heavy. They said they were ashamed for me, I was so great a liar, and had earnestly told them so many ugly falsehoods. I said, my speech to them could hurt no honest persons. My head, my eyes, my heart, assured me their hearts were thinned like the snakes, and my tongue only spoke the speech of honest wisdom, so as to save myself from being bitten, that it was the property of poisonous snakes, when they missed their aim, to be enraged, and hide their heads in their hateful coil, and concluded, by telling them I went through the woods to Yaoan, to show them publicly I was not hurt by lurking snakes, and that I would now return to the harmless Chicasa, and tell them so. On this we parted. A timely application of proper measures with the savages is our only method to secure their feeble affection. If those who are employed for that salutary purpose justly pursued that point, its effect would soon be openly declared by the friendly behavior and honest conduct of the various Western nations. But where interest governs, iniquitous measures are pursued, and painters can be got who will flatter the original, be it ever so black. Some of our chiefs, with a certain military officer in West Florida, like trembling mice, humbly voted not to demand any satisfaction from the savages for that most shocking act of cool murder I have just mentioned, lest it should provoke them to do us more mischief. but to the honor of George Johnstone, Esq., then governor of West Florida, as a representative of the suffering people, he despised such obsequious and pusillanimous counsels, and insisted, in his usual manly manner, on an equal revenge of blood, and had it speedily granted, as far as the situation of affairs could possible allow, for by a council of the Red Sanhedrim, they condemned 3 of the chief murderers to be killed, and formally sent down to him 2 of their scalps to stop the loud voice of blood, but the 3rd made off to the Chirake, by which means he evaded his justly deserved fate, and too nice a scrutiny at such a time would not have been convenient. All the Western Indian nations bear the highest regard to that paternal governor and plain friend of all the people, and I record his conduct to do justice to so uncommon a character in America, as well as to engage his successors to pursue the same measures and copy after him. The Choctaw, by not having deep rivers or creeks to purify themselves by daily ablutions, are become very irreligious in other respects, for of late years they make no annual atonement for sin. As very few of them can swim, this is a full solicited his auditor as a benevolent kinsman to assist him in his distress, but the other kept his ear deaf to his importunity, and entirely evaded the artful aim of the petitioner by carrying on a discourse he had begun before his relation accosted him as a suppliant. Each alternately began where they had left off, the one to enforce the compliance of his prayer, and the other, like the deaf adder, to elude the power of its charming him. Nature has in a very surprising manner endued the Indian Americans with a strong comprehensive memory and great flow of language. I listened with close attention to their speeches for a considerable time. At last the petitioner, despairing of impressing the other with sentiments in his favor, was forced to drop his false and tragical tale, and become seemingly a patient hearer of the conclusion of the other's long narrative, which was given him with a great deal of outward composure and cool good nature. In the years 1746 and 1747, I was frequently perplexed by the Choctaw mendicants, which policy directed me to bear and conceal as well as I could, because I was then transacting public business with them. In 1747, one of their warriors and a Choctaw came to me for presents, which according to my usual custom in those times, I gave, though much less than they presumed to expect. The former strongly declaimed against the penurious spirit of the French, and then highly applauded the open, generous tempers of the English traders. For a considerable time, he contrasted them with each other, not forgetting, in every point of comparison, to give us the preference in a high degree. He was endued with so much eloquence and skill as to move the passions, and obtain his point. A considerable number of Chickasaw warriors who were present told me soon after that his skillful method of addressing me for a bottle of spirituous liquors seemed to them astonishing. An old beloved man replied that the worst sort of snakes were endued with the greatest skill to ensnare and suck their prey, whereas the harmless have no such power. The Indians in general do not choose to drink any spirits unless they can quite intoxicate themselves. When in that helpless and sordid condition, weeping and asking for more home, bitter waters, I saw one of the drunkard's relations, who some time before had taken a like dose, hold the rum bottle to the other's head, saying, when he had drank deep, "Ha, you were very poor for drinking." Though I appealed to all the Chickasaw warriors present that rum never stood on hand with me when the people were at home, and several times affirmed to the importunate Choctaw that it was entirely expended, yet my denial served only to make him more earnest. Upon this, I told him that though I had no home, I had a full bottle of the water of home, bitter ears, meaning long pepper, of which he was ignorant, as he had seen none of that kind. We were of opinion that his eager thirst for liquor, as well as his ignorance of the burning quality of the pepper, and the resemblance of the words, which signify things of a hot, though different nature, would induce the bacchanal to try it. He accordingly applauded my generous disposition, and said his heart had all the while told him I would not act beneath the character I bore among his country people. The bottle was brought, I laid it on the table, and told him, as he was then spitting very much, a general custom with the Indians, when they are eager for anything, if I drank it all at one sitting, it would cause me to spit in earnest, as I used it only when I ate, and then very moderately, but though I loved it, if his heart was very poor for it, I should be silent, and not in the least grudge him for pleasing his mouth. He said, "Your heart is honest indeed, I thank you, for it is good to my heart, and makes it greatly to rejoice. Without any farther ceremony, he seized the bottle, uncorked it, and swallowed a large quantity of the burning liquid, till he was near strangled. He gasped for a considerable time, and as soon as he recovered his breath, he said "Ha," and soon after kept stroking his throat with his right hand. When the violence of this burning draught was pretty well over, he began to flourish away, in praise of the strength of the liquor and bounty of the giver. He then went to his companion, and held the bottle to his mouth, according to custom, till he took several hearty swallows. This Indian seemed rather more sensible of its fiery quality than the other, for it suffocated him for a considerable time, but as soon as he recovered his breath, he tumbled about on the floor in various postures like a drunken person, overcome by the force of liquor. In this manner, each of them renewed their draught, till they had finished the whole bottle, into which 2 others had been decanted. The Chickasaw spectators were surprised at their tasteless and voracious appetite, and laughed heartily at them, mimicking the actions, language, and gesture of drunken savages. The burning liquor so highly inflamed their bodies that one of the Choctaws, to cool his inward parts, drank water till he almost burst, the other, rather than bear the ridicule of the people, and the inward fire that distracted him, drowned himself the second night after in a broad and shallow clay hole, contiguous to the dwelling house of his uncle, who was the Chickasaw Archimagus. There was an incident, something similar, which happened in the year 1736, in Canutar, the most northern town of the Chirake. When all the liquor was expended, the Indians went home, leading with them, at my request, those who were drunk. One, however, soon came back, and earnestly importuned me for more Nwoti, which signifies both physic and spirituous liquors. They, as they are now become great liars, suspect all others of being infected with their own disposition and principles. The more I excused myself, the more anxious he grew, so as to become offensive. I then told him I had only 1/4 of a bottle of strong physic, which sick people might drink in small quantities, for the cure of inward pains, and laying it down before him, I declared I did not on any account choose to part with it, but as his speech of few words had become very long and troublesome, he might do just as his heart directed him concerning it. He took it up, saying his heart was very poor for physic, but that would cure it, and make it quite straight. The bottle contained almost 3 gills of strong spirits of turpentine, which in a short time he drank off. Such a quantity of the like physic would have demolished me, or any white person. The Indians in general are either capable of suffering exquisite pain longer than we are, or of shewing more constancy and composure in their torments. The troublesome visitors soon tumbled down and foamed prodigiously. I then sent for some of his relations to carry him home. They came. I told them he drank greedily, and too much of the physic. They said it was his usual custom when the red people bought the English physic. They gave him a decoction of proper herbs and roots, the next day sweated him, repeated the former draught, and he soon got well. As those turpentine spirits did not inebriate him, but only inflamed his intestines, he well remembered the burning quality of my favorite physic, which he had so indiscreetly drank up, and cautioned the rest from ever teasing me for any physic I had concealed, and any sort of bottles, for my own use, otherwise they might be sure it would spoil them, like the eating of fire. The Choctaw are in general more slender than any other nation of savages I have seen. They are raw-boned, and surprisingly active in ball playing, which is a very sharp exercise and requires great strength and exertion. In this manly exercise, no persons are known to be equal to them, or in running on level ground, to which they are chiefly used from their infancy, on account of the situation of their country, which hath plenty of hills, but no mountains. These lie at a considerable distance between them and the Muskogee. On the survey of a prodigious space of fertile land up the Mississippi, and its numberless fine branches, we found the mountains full 300 miles from that great winding mass of waters. Though the lands of West Florida, for a considerable distance from the seashore, are very low, sour, wet, and unhealthy, yet it abounds with valuable timber for shipbuilding, which could not well be expended in the long space of many centuries. This is a very material article to so great a maritime power as Great Britain, especially as it can be got with little expense and trouble. The French were said to deal pretty much that way, and the Spaniards, it is likely, will now resume it, as the bounty of our late ministry has allowed the French to transfer New Orleans to them, and by that means they are able to disturb the British colonies at pleasure. It cannot fail of proving a constant bone of contention. A few troops could soon have taken it during the late war, for it was incapable of making any considerable resistance, and even French effrontery could not have presumed to withhold the giving it up, if the makers of our last memorable peace had not been so extremely modest or liberal to them. If it be allowed that the first discoverers and possessors of a foreign waste country have a just title to it, the French, by giving up New Orleans to Great Britain, would have only ceded to her possessions which they had no right to keep, for Colonel Wood was the first discoverer of the Mississippi, who stands on public record, and the chief part of 10 years he employed in searching its course. This spirited attempt he began in the year 1654, and ended 1664. Captain Bolton made the like attempt in the year 1670. Dr. Cox of New Jersey sent 2 ships anno 1698, which discovered the mouth of it, and having failed 100 miles up, he took possession of the about Christmas, the he and she bears always separate. The former usually snaps off a great many branches of trees, with which he makes the bottom of his winter's bed, and carefully raises it to a proper height, with the green tops of large canes. He chooses such solitary thickets as are impenetrable by the sunbeams. The she-bear takes an old large hollow tree for her yeaning winter house, and chooses to have the door above, to enable her to secure her young ones from danger. When anything disturbs them, they gallop up a tree, champing their teeth, and bristling their hair, in a frightful manner, and when they are wounded, it is surprising from what a height they will pitch on the ground, with their weighty bodies, and how soon they get up, and run off. When they take up their winter quarters, they continue the greater part of 2 months, and almost an entire state of inactivity. During that time, their tracks reach no farther than to the next water, of which they seldom drink, as they frequently suck their paws in their lonely recess, and impoverish their bodies, to nourish them. While they are employed in that the surprising task of nature, they cannot contain themselves in silence, but are so well pleased with their repast, that they continue singing hum, as their pipes are none of the weakest. The Indians by this means often are led to them from a considerable distance, and then shoot them down. But they are forced to cut a hole near the root of the tree, wherein the she-bear and her cubs are lodged, and drive them out by the force of fire and suffocating smoke, and as the tree is partly rotten and the inside dry, it soon takes fire. In this case, they become very fierce, and would fight any kind of enemy, but, commonly, at the first shot, they are either killed or mortally wounded. However, if the hunter chanced to miss his aim, he speedily makes off to a sapling, which the bear by overclasping cannot climb. The crafty hunting dogs then act their part by biting behind and gnawing its hams till it takes up a tree. I have been often assured both by Indians and others, who get their bread by hunting in the woods, that the she-bear always endeavors to keep apart from the male during the helpless state of her young ones, otherwise he would endeavor to kill them, and that they had frequently seen the she-bear kill the male on the spot, after a desperate engagement for the defense of her young ones. Of the great numbers I have seen with their young cubs, I never saw a he-bear, at such times, to associate with them, so that it seems one part of the Roman satirist's fine moral lesson, inculcating peace and friendship, is not just scoevis inter esse convenient ursus. At the time Mobile, that graveyard for Britons, was ceded to Great Britain, the lower towns of the Choctaw brought down all the Chickasaw scalps they had taken, in their thievish way of war, and had them new painted, and carried them in procession on green boughs of pine, by way of bravado, to show their contempt of the English. They would not speak a word to the Chickasaw traders, and they solicited the French for their consent to recommence war against us, and establish them again by force of arms in their western possessions, but they told them their king had firmly concluded upon the cession, through his own benevolence of heart, to prevent the further effusion of innocent blood. By this artful address, they supported their credit with the savages, in the very point which ought to have ruined it. When the Choctaw found themselves dipped in war with the Muskogee, they solicited the English for a supply of ammunition, urging with much truth that common sense ought to direct us to assist them, and deem the others our enemies as much as theirs. But Tumbek garrison was evaluated through the unmanly fear of giving umbrage to the Muskogee, at the very time it would have been of the utmost service to the general interest of our colonies to have continued it. The commander concealed his timorous and precipitate retreat, even from me and another old trader, till the very night he confusedly set off for Mobile by water, and left to us the trouble of apologizing to the savages for his misconduct. But after he got to a place of safety, he flourished away of his wisdom and prowess. As a just stigma on those who abuse their public trust, I cannot help observing that in imitation of some other rulers, he persuaded the Indians not to pay us any of our numerous outstanding debts, though contrary to what was specified in our trading licenses. They have not courage enough to venture their own valuable lives to those red marts of trade. If they had, they would persuade the Indians rather to pay their debts honestly, year by year, as we trust them in their want, and depend on their promise and fidelity. The gentleman, who formerly traded with the Muskogee, told me that the Georgia governor, through a like generous principle, forgave that nation once all the numerous debts they owed the traders. But as soon as the Indians understood they would not be credited again, under any circumstances whatsoever, they consented to pay their debts, and declared the governor to be a great madman, by pretending to forgive debts contracted for valuable goods, which he never purchased, nor intended to pay for. Though the French Louisianians were few, and far dispersed, as well as surrounded by the savages, yet close application and abilities in their various appointments sufficiently made up their lack of numbers. When, and where, their security seemed to require it, they with a great deal of art fomented divisions among their turbulent red neighbors, and endeavored to keep the balance of power pretty even between them. Though they had only one garrison in the country of the Muskogee, and another in that of the Choctaw, yet the commanders of those two posts managed so well that they intimidated those two potent nations. By raising misunderstandings between them, and threatening, when occasion required, to set the one against the other, with their red legions of the north, unless ample satisfaction was speedily given by the offending party, and solemn promises of a strict observance of true friendship for the time to come. How far our superintendents and commissioners of Indian affairs have imitated that wise copy, our traders can feelingly describe, and it will be a happiness if our 3 western colonies have not the like experience in the space of a few years. We assure them that either the plan or the means for producing such an effect has been pretty well concerted by the authors of that dangerous and fatal peace between the Muskogee and Choctaw. Their own party indeed will greatly applaud it, and so will the much obliged Spaniards, especially if they soon enter into a war with Great Britain. It is to be wished that those who preach peace and goodwill to all the savage murderers of the British Americans would do the same as to their American fellow subjects, and not, as some have lately done, cry peace to the Indians, and seek to plunge the mercenary swords of soldiers into the breasts of those of our loyal colonists, who are the most powerful of us, because they oppose the measures of an arbitrary ministry, and will not be enslaved. In the year 1766, the Choctaw received a considerable blow from the Muskogee. Their old distinguished war leader, before spoken of, Mingo Hama Ekido, set off against the Muskogee with 160 warriors to cut off by surprise one of their barrier towns. As the waters were low, a couple of runners brought him a message from the nation, acquainting him there were 2 white men on their way to the Muskogee, and therefore desired him to send them back, lest they should inform them of the expedition, and by that means endanger the lives of the whole. But though he treated these traitors kindly at his war camp, and did not show the least diffidence of them respecting their secrecy, and sent this account back by the running messengers to his advisers, that the English were his friends, and could not be reasonably suspected of betraying them, if it were only on the situation of their own trading business, which frequently called them to various places, yet those base-minded and perfidious men violated the generous faith reposed in them, and betrayed the lives of their credulous friends. They set off with long marches, and as soon as they arrived in the country of the Muskogee, minutely informed them of the Choctaws' hostile intentions, and number, and the probable place of attacking the aforesaid camp to the best advantage. The news was joyfully received, and, as they had reason to believe they could surprise the enemy, or take them at a disadvantage, in some convenient place near their own barriers, a number of chosen warriors well prepared set off in order to save their former credit, by revenging the repeated affronts the Choctaw leader had given them in every engagement. He, in the most insulting manner, had often challenged their whole nation to meet him and his at any fixed time of a moon and place, and fight it out, when the conquerors should be masters of the conquered, for the Muskogee used to ridicule the Choctaw by saying they were like wolf cubs, who would not take the water, but the thick swamp, as their only place of security against the enemy. It must here be remembered that the Indians in general are guided by their dreams when they attend their holy ark to war, reckoning them so many oracles, or divine intimations, designed for their good. By virtue of those supposed sacred dictates, they will sometimes return home, by 1, 2, or 3 at a time, without the least censure, and even with applause, for this their religious conduct. Thus, 120 of these Choctaw, after having intimidated themselves apart from the rest, with visionary notions, left the war camp and returned home. Our gallant friend, Mingo Hama Ekito, addressed his townsmen on this, and persuaded them to follow him against the enemy, saying, it was the part of brave warriors to keep awake, and not dream like old women. He told them their national credit was at stake for their warlike conduct under him, and that honor prompted him to proceed against the Formerly, by virtue of the pressing engagement of a prime magistrate of South Carolina, I undertook to open a trade with the Choctaw and reconcile their old-standing enmity with the Chickasaw. I was promised to be indemnified in all necessary charges attending that attempt. As the Choctaw, by the persuasions of the French, had killed my partner in the trade, I was desirous of any favorable opportunity of retaliating, especially as we were exposed to perpetual dangers and losses by the French rewards offered either for our scalps or horses' tails, and as the French were usually short of goods, while Great Britain was at war with them, we were liable to most damages from them in time of peace. They used to keep an alphabetical list of all the names of leading savages in the various nations where they garrisoned themselves, and they duly paid them, every year, a certain quantity of goods besides, for all the damages they did to the Chickasaw and our traders, which tempted them constantly to exert their abilities to the good liking of their political employers. It happened, however, that one of the French of Tumbic Fort, being guided by Venus instead of Apollo, was detected in violating the law of marriage with the favorite wife of the warlike chieftain of Quanchido, Shulashamashtabe, who by his several transcendent qualities had arrived to the highest pitch of the Red Glory. He was well known in Georgia and South Carolina by the name of Red Shoes, as formerly noticed. As there lived in his town a number of the Choctaw, the senior tribe of the Chickasaw and Choctaw, and who had a free intercourse with each of their countries, we soon had an account of every material thing that passed there. I, therefore, resolved to improve so favorable an opportunity as seemed to present itself, and accordingly soon privately convened 2 of the leading men of the Choctaw Nation to assist me to execute the plan I had in view. One was the Archimagus, past Abe, known in our colonies by the name of the Jockey, and the other by that of Paamingo Amalata, who was the only Indian I ever knew to die of a consumption, which he contracted by various engagements with the enemy when far off at war, contrary to their general rule of martial purification. The violent exercise of running a great distance under the violent rays of the sun, and over sandy or hilly grounds, would not allow him to enswamp, and he fired his blood to such a degree that a few years after this, when on a visit to our English settlement, he died at Augusta with this ailment. It is needful to mention those well-known circumstances, as the following relation of facts depends in a considerable measure on them. We 3 agreed to send some presents to Red Shoes, with a formal speech, desiring him to accept them with a kind heart, and shake hands with us as became brothers, according to the old beloved speech. Their own friendly messages and treaties of peace are always accompanied with so many sorts of presents as their chiefs number. We in a few days packed up a sufficient quantity to bury the tomahawk which the French had thrust into their unwilling hands, and to dry up the tears of the injured, and set their hearts at ease for the time to come, by joining with the English and their old friendly Chickasaw, Ingona Sekanupa Tukanes, and the triple knot of friendship, in order to cut off the dangerous snake's head, and utterly destroy the power of its forked tongue. As our real grievances were mutually the same and numerous, we gave liberally. Having everything as well concerted for the embassy as such occasions require, my two red friends sent a trusty messenger for a couple of the foresaid neutral Indians, who had been a few days in the Choctaw country, to accompany him late at night to my trading house. They readily obeyed, and, as the good-natured men and their families, through friendship to us, must infallibly have been sacrificed to French policy if we failed of success, or they were discovered by captives, or any other means, we used the greatest secrecy, and placed a sentinel to keep off all other persons during our private congress. After we had conversed with them a considerable time on the necessity of the proposed attempt and the certainty of succeeding in it, we opened our two large budgets and read over the strong emblematical contents, according to their idiom, till we gave them a true impression of the whole. The next day we took care to send them off well pleased, and as several material circumstances conspired to assure us they would faithfully discharge the office of trust, which we reposed in them, we in a short time had the satisfaction to hear by other private runners of their countrymen, from our brave and generous patron, Red Shoes, that they were so far from breaking the public faith, that they read to him every material head of our embassy, and urged it with all their powers. That red chieftain introduced our friendly embassy with such secrecy and address to all the headmen he could confide in that he soon persuaded most of them in all the neighboring towns to join heartily with him in his laudable plan. The sharpness of his own feelings for the base injury he had received from the French, and the well-adapted presents we sent him and his wife and gallant associates, contributed greatly to give a proper weight to our embassy. Such motives as these are too often the mainsprings that move the various wheels of government, even in the Christian world. In about a month from the time we began to treat with Red Shoes, he sent a considerable body of his warriors, with presents to me, as the representative of the English traders, and to my Choctaw friends, consisting of swan's wings, white beads, pipes, and tobacco, which was a strong confirmation of our treaty of peace, and he earnestly requested of me to inform them with that candor which should always be observed by honest friends, whether I could firmly engage that our traders would live and deal among them, as we did with the Choctaw, for a disappointment that way, he said, would prove fatal, should we entangle them with the French, and resentment of the many injuries they had long unprovoked done us. I quieted their apprehensions on that material point of jealousy, to their entire satisfaction, and my two Choctaw friends soon expatiated upon the subject to him, with a great deal of that life, wit, and humor, so peculiar to the red Americans. We explained and confirmed anew the whole contents of our former talk concerning the dangerous French snake, assuring them that if they did not soon exert themselves against it, as became brave free men, they would still continue not only poor and shamefully naked, below the state of other human beings, but be despised and abused, in proportion to their mean passive conduct, their greatest and most favorite war chieftains not excepted, as they saw verified in their chief leader, Shula Shumashteb. But if they exerted themselves, they would be as happy as our friendly, brave, and free Choctaw, whom the French armies, and all their red confederates, could no way damage but as hidden snakes, on account of their own valor, and the steady friendship of the English, who were always faithful to their friends even to death, as every river and creek sufficiently testified, all the way from the English settlements to the Choctaw country. We mentioned how many were killed at several places, as they were going in a warlike manner to supply their beloved friends, without any being ever captivated by the numerous enemy, though often attacked at a disadvantage, which ought to assure them that whenever the English shake hands with people, their hearts were always honest. We requested them therefore to think and act as our brotherly Choctaw, who by strongly holding the chain of friendship between them and the English, were able in their open fields to destroy the French armies, and in the woods bravely to fight and baffle all the efforts of their despicable mercenary enemies, though their numbers of fighting men consisted of few more than 100 to what the Choctaw contained in old hundreds, or thousands. The French, we added, were liberal indeed, but to whom, or for what? They gave presents to the headmen and the most eloquent speakers of their country to enslave the rest, but would not supply them with arms and ammunition without the price of blood against our traitors and the friendly Chickasaw, that they themselves were witnesses. A whole town of sprightly, promising young men had not now more than 5 or 6 guns, but they would learn to kill as many deer as the distinguished Chickasaw hunters, if they firmly shook hands with the English. We convinced them that the true emblem of the English was a dressed white deerskin, but that the French dealt with them only in long scalping knives, that we had a tender feeling when we heard the mourning voice of the tender-hearted widow, and only supplied our friends in their own defense, or in revenge of crying blood, but that the French delighted in blood, and were always plotting how to destroy them and take away their lands, by setting them at war against those who loved them, and would secure their liberties without any other view than as became brothers who fairly exchanged their goods. We desired them to view the Chickasaw striplings, how readily their kindly hearts led them to listen to the friendly speech of their English trading speaker, because they knew we loved them, and enabled them to appear in the genteel dress of red people. At the whoop, they soon appeared, and cheerfully complied with our various requests, to the great satisfaction of our new Choctaw friends. The Chickasaw headmen told them with pleasure that they were glad their own honest eyes had seen the pure effects of love to their English trader, and that their old people, time out of mind, had taught them so. Then they humorously enlarged on the unfriendly conduct of the French in a comparative manner, and persuaded them to keep their eyes open, and remember well what they had seen and heard, and to tell it to all their headmen. We adjusted everything in the most friendly manner, to the entire satisfaction of the Choctaw. I supplied each of them with arms, ammunition, and presents in plenty, saddled a fine, strong, sprightly horse he chanced to have at hand. Just as he mounted, the dreadful death who whoop was sounded in pursuit of him, with the swift-footed red Asahel, Shulashamashtabe, leading the chase. Though, from that place, the land path was mostly level to Tumpicby garrison, about half a day's march, and though the Chickasaw and Choctaw horses are Spanish barbs, and long-winded, like wolves, yet Red Shoes, far ahead of the rest, ran him down in about the space of 15 miles, and had scalped the unfortunate riders sometime before the rest appeared. It is surprising to see the long-continued speed of the Indians in general, though some of us have often ran the swiftest of them out of sight when on the chase in a collective body for about the distance of 12 miles, yet, afterward, without any seeming toil, they would stretch on, leave us out of sight, and outwind any horse. When this retaliating scheme was planned and executed, I was the only British subject in the Chickasaw country, and as I had many goods on hand, I stayed in the nation, while we sent down our horses to the first English settlements, which was full 800 miles distant, before the 2 Floridas were ceded to us. 17 were the broken days, according to the Indian phrase, when the Choctaw engaged to return with the French scalps, as a full confirmation of their having declared war against them, and of their ardent desire of always shake hands with the English. The power of the French red mercenaries was however so very great, that Red Shoes could not with safety comply with his deputy's promise to me, to send the French snake's head, in the time appointed by our sticks hieroglyphically painted, and notched in due form. The fall time drawing on, obliged me to set off for the Coosa town, which is the most western of the Muskogee Nation, about 300 miles distant. I was accompanied by my 2 cheerful and gallant Chickasaw friends, already mentioned, with 40 of their chosen warriors, brave as ever trod the ground, and faithful under the greatest dangers even to the death. On 3 our way down, escorting the returning cargo, for Chickasaw, who were passing home through the woods, having discovered us, and observing in the evening a large camp of 80 French Choctaw in pursuit of us, they returned on our tracks at full speed, to put us on our guard, but though we were so few, and had many women and children to protect, besides other encumbrances, yet as the enemy knew by our method of camping and marching, we had discovered them, they durst not attack us. Another time there was a hunting camp of only 17 Chickasaw, with their wives and children, who were attacked by above 60 Choctaw, but they fought them a long time, and so desperately that they killed and wounded several, and drove them shamefully off, without any loss. It is usual for the women to sing the enlivening war song in the time of an attack, and it inflames the men's spirits so highly that they become as fierce as lions. I never knew an instance of the Indians running off, though from a numerous enemy, and leaving their women and children to their barbarous hands. Soon after we arrived at the upper western town of the Muskogee, which was called Ooyasa, and settled by the Chickasaw and Nachi, a great company of Red Shoes warriors came up with me, with the French scalps and other trophies of war, but because a body of our Muskogee mercenary traders found their account in dealing with the French at the Alabama fort, they, to the great risk of their own country's welfare, lodged so many caveats in my way by the mediation of the Muskogee, that I found it necessary to consent that the scalps should be sent with the other trophies, in a Muskogee white deerskin, to the French fort at the distance of 70 miles, to be buried deep in the ground, instead of sending them by the Choctaw runners to His Excellency the Governor of South Carolina, who had engaged me to strive to open a trade with those Indians. These opulent and mercenary white savages being now dead, I shall not disgrace the page with their worthless names. Soon after we had reached the Chickasaw country, Red Shoes came to pay us a friendly visit, accompanied with a great many headmen and warriors, both to be relieved in their poverty, and to concert the best measures of still annoying the common enemy. We behaved kindly and free to them, to their entire satisfaction, and sent considerable presents to many headmen who stayed at home, in confirmation of our strong friendship, acquainting them of our various plans of operation against the enemy, in defense of their lives, freedom, and liberty of trade, in which the English and Chickasaw would faithfully support them. Everything was delivered to them according to our intention, and as kindly received. And as all the Indians are fond of well-timed novelty, especially when they expect to be gainers by it, the name of the friendly and generous English was now echoed from town to town, except in those few which had large pensions from the French. In the beginning of the following spring, which was 1747, above 50 warriors from several towns of the Muskogee came to the Chickasaw country on their way to war against the Aquapa Indians on the western side of the Mississippi, 150 miles above the Nachi Old Fields. By our good treatment of them and well-timed application, they joined a body of Chickasaw warriors under Pyamataha and made a fleet of large cypress bark canoes, in which they embarked under the direction of 3 red admirals and long pettiaugers that had been taken from the French as they were passing from New Orleans up to the Illinois. They proceeded down the Mississippi to the French settlements and attacked and burned a large village at break of day, though under the command of a stockade fort, from which the Chickasaw leader was wounded with a grape shot in his side. On this, as they despaired of his life, according to their universal method in such a case, they killed most of their unfortunate captives on the western bank of the Mississippi, and enraged with fury, they overspread the French settlements to a great distance, like a dreadful whirlwind, destroying everything before them, to the astonishment and terror even of those who were far remote from the skirts of the direful storm. The French Louisianians were now in a desponding state, as we had beaten them in their own favorite political element, in which they had too often been successful even at the British court, after our troops and navies had scoured them out of the field and the ocean. They had no reason here to expect any favor of us, as we were only retaliating the long train of the innocent blood of our fellow subjects they had wantonly caused to be shed by their red mercenaries, and their fears now became as great as their danger, but they were needless, for though the Alabama French and many towns of the Muskogee were in a violent ferment when the foresaid warriors returned home, yet by the treacherous mediation of the above-mentioned traders and their base associates, the breach was made up. Had they been blessed with the least spark of that love for the good of their country, which the savages and French are, they could have then persuaded the Indians to have driven the French from the dangerous Alabama, and an alliance with the Chickasaw and Choctaw would have effectually destroyed the dangerous line of circumvallation they afterwards drew around our valuable colonies. And as the Cherokee, by their situation, might easily have been induced to join in the formidable treaty, they with encouragement would have proved far superior to all the northern red legions the French were connected with. At that time I sent to the governor of South Carolina a large packet relating the true situation of our Indian affairs, directed on His Majesty's service, but though it contained many things of importance, which the French, under such circumstances, would have faithfully improved, and required immediate dispatch, our Muskogee traders, to whose care I had sent it by some Chickasaw runners, were so daringly base as to open it, and destroy what their self-interested views seemed to require, and delayed the conveyance of the rest a considerable time, to prevent others from reaping the benefit of the trade before them. When I went down, I complained of their misconduct, and the governor, having promised me a public seal, threatened them loudly, but some after circumstances in trade made him to think it not worth while to put his threats in execution. When the French were destitute of goods at Tumbuck garrisons, while they were at war with the English, their policy allowed them to suffer several of our traders to deal with the Choctaw without any interruption, in order to keep them quiet, but as soon as they had a proper supply, they excited their treacherous friends to plunder and kill our people. They, who had the fortune to get safe away, made great returns, which induced some to entertain too high notions of their profits, and so strangers hazarded too much at once. While the French had possession of Tumbuck, we, who knew them, used to send their only small cargoes from the Chickasaw country, to avoid tempting them too far, but one of our great men was reported to have persuaded a couple of gentlemen to join in company with his brother, well known by the name of the SPHYNX Company, in the Choctaw trade, and to have supplied them very largely. They loaded and sent off 360 valuable horses, which with all other concomitant charges, and going to such a far distant country, swelled it to a high amount. The traders, who were employed to vend the valuable cargo, gave large presents to 6 of the Muskogee leaders, known to be most attached to the British interest, to escort them, with a body of the Choctaw, into the country. They passed by Alabama, in the usual parade of the Indian traders, to the terror of the people in the fort. They proceeded as far as a powerful body of our Choctaw friends had appointed to meet them, but considerably overstayed the fixed time there, in want of provisions, as their common safety would not allow them to go a-hunting. By the forcible persuasion of the Muskogee headmen, they unluckily returned about 140 miles back on a northeast course. But a few days after, I shall here mention an instance of that kind. At this time, a hunting camp of the Chickasaw went out to the extent of their winter limits between the Choctaw and Muskogee countries, but being desirous of enlarging their hunt, they sent off a sprightly young warrior to discover certain lands they were unacquainted with, which they pointed to by the course of the sun, lying at the distance of about 30 miles. Near that place, he came up with a camp of Choctaw, who seemed to treat him kindly, giving him venison and parched corn to eat, but while he was eating what some of the women had laid before him, one of the Choctaw creeped behind him and sunk his tomahawk into his head. His associates helped him to carry away the victim, and they hid it in a hollow tree, at a considerable distance from their camp, after which they speedily removed. When the time for his return was elapsed, the Chickasaw, next day, made a place of security for their women and children, under the protection of a few warriors, and the morning following, painted themselves red and black, and went in quest of their kinsmen. Though they were strangers to the place, any farther than by their indications to him before he set off, yet so swift and skillful woodsmen were they, that at 12 o'clock that day, they came to the Choctaw camping place, where, after a narrow search, they discovered the trace of blood on a fallen tree, and a few drops of fresh blood on the leaves of trees, and the course they had dragged the corpse. These directed them to the wooden urn, wherein the remains of their kinsmen were enclosed. They said, as they were men and warriors, it belonged to the female relations to weep for the dead, and to them to revenge it. They soon concluded to carry off the corpse to the opposite side of a neighboring swamp, and then to pursue. Having deposited the body out of the reach of beasts of prey, they set off in pursuit of the Choctaw. They came up with them before daylight, surrounded their camp, attacked them, killed one, and wounded several, whooping aloud that they were Chickasaw, who never first loosed the friend knot between them and others, nor failed in revenging blood. But ye are roguish Choctaw, you know you are likewise cowards, and that you are worse than wolves, for they kill, only that they may eat. But you give your friends something to eat, that you may kill them with safety. They told them, as they had left their gallant relation unscalped in a tree, they left their cowardly one in like manner, alongside of another tree. They put up the death who whoop, returned, scaffolded their dead kinsmen, and joined their own camp without any interruption. The reader will be able to form a proper judgment of the temper and abilities of the Indian savages from these facts. Our Choctaw traders, having been thus induced to return to the Muskogee country, proceeded soon afterwards 70 miles on almost a northern course, and from thence to the Chickasaw about west by north, 300 miles of very mountainous land, till within 40 miles of that extensive and fertile country, afterward, on a southern direction to the Choctaw, 160 miles. This was a very oblique course, somewhat resembling the letter G reverted, its tail from Charlestown, consisting of 720 miles, and the head of 530, in all 1,250 miles, a great distance to travel through woods, with loaded horses, where they shifted as they could, when the day's march was over, and through the varying seasons of the year. These traders were charged with great neglect, and being so long before they reached the Choctaw country, this was to invalidate the pretensions of 2 other gentlemen towards obtaining bills of exchange on the government, according to the strong promises they had, for any losses they might sustain in a Choctaw cargo of goods, etc. Notwithstanding the former were utter strangers to the Chickasaw and Choctaw, and in justice could only expect the common privilege of British subjects, yet His Excellency bestowed on them a large piece of written sheepskin, bearing the impression of the threatening lion and unicorn, to frighten every other trader from dealing with the Choctaw, at their peril. The Chickasaw traders were much terrified at the unusual sight of the enlivened pictures of such voracious animals. My situation caused me then to be silent on that strange point, but when the chief of them, who carried those beeswax pictures, came to my trading house, chiefly to enlarge on the dreadful power of those fierce creatures, I told him, as they answered the design, and making so many trembling believers among the Indians, I did not imagine him so weak as to attempt to impose his scarecrows upon me, but that, as His Excellency had dipped me too deep in a dangerous and very expensive affair, and had done me the honor to send for me to Charlestown on His Majesty's service, at the very time I could have secured them in the esteem of the fickle Choctaw, I should not by any means oppose their aim of grasping the whole Choctaw trade, be their plan ever so unwise and unfair. The letter the gentleman delivered to me was dated April 22nd, anno 1747, in which His Excellency acknowledged, in very obliging terms, that I had been very serviceable to the government by my management among the Choctaw, and might be assured of his countenance and friendship. As the rest of it concerned myself and other matters, and contained some things of the measures of government relating to the point in view, it may be right not to publish it, but it is among the public records in Charlestown, and may be seen in the Secretary's office. The traders, after this interview, set off for the Choctaw, and I in a few days to South Carolina. Soon after I arrived at Charlestown, I could not but highly resent the governor's ungenerous treatment of, and injustice to me, in sending for me to the neglect of my trade, only to carry on his unparalleled favorite scheme, and I soon set off for the Chickasaw, without taking the least formal leave of His Excellency. By some means, he soon knew of my departure, and persuaded G.N. Esquire, one of the 2 friends in South Carolina, who only could influence me against my own liking, to follow till he overtook me, and urge me to return, and accompany me to His Excellency's house. At his earnest solicitations, the gentleman complied, came up with me, and prevailed on me to go back according to request. I had plenty of courtly excuses for my complaints and grievances, and in the hearing of my friend was earnestly pressed to forget and forgive all that was past, with solemn promises of full redress, according to his former engagement of drawing bills of exchange in my favor on the government, if South Carolina had not honor enough to repay me what I had expended in opening a trade with the numerous Choctaw, besides gratuities for hardships, hazards, etc. I wish I could here also celebrate his sincerity and faithfulness on this occasion, as I could not well suspect a breach of public faith, after it had been pledged in so solemn a manner. He had not much difficulty in detaining me on sundry pretexts, till the expected great Choctaw crop of deerskins and beaver must have been gathered, before I could possibly return to the Chickasaw country, and from thence proceed to rival the SPHYNX Company. Under those circumstances, I was detained so late in November that the snow fell upon me at Edisto the first day, in company with Captain W.D., an old trader of the Aquask, who was going to Savannah. In the severity of winter, frost, snow, hail, and heavy rains succeed each other in these climes, so that I partly rode and partly swam to the Chickasaw country, for not expecting to stay long below, I took no leathern canoe. Many of the broad, deep creeks that were almost dry when I went down had now far overflowed their banks, ran at a rapid rate, and were unpassable to any but desperate people. When I got within 40 miles of the Chickasaw, the rivers and swamps were dreadful, by rafts of timber driving down the former, and the great fallen trees floating in the latter, for near a mile in length. Being forced to wade deep through cane swamps or woody thickets, it proved very troublesome to keep my firearms dry, on which, as a second means, my life depended, for, by the high rewards of the French, some enemies were always rambling about in search of us. On the eastern side of one of the rivers, and taking a sweep early in a wet morning, in quest of my horses, I discovered smoke on a small piece of rising ground in a swamp, pretty near the edge. I moved nearer from tree to tree, till I discovered them to be Choctaw creeping over the fire. I withdrew without being discovered, or the least apprehension of danger, as at the worst, I could have immediately enswamped, secured a retreat with my trusty firearms, and taken through the river and the broad swamp, which then resembled a mixed ocean of wood and water. I soon observed the tracks of my horses, found them, and set off. At the distance of 100 yards from the river, there was a large and deep lagoon, in the form of a semicircle. As soon as I swam this, and got on the bank, I drank a good draught of rum. In the middle of the river, I was forced to throw away one of my belt pistols, and a long French scalping knife I had found, where the Choctaw killed 2 of our traders. When I got on the opposite shore, I renewed my draught, put my firearms in order, and set up the war whoop. I had often the like scenes, till I got to the Chickasaw country, which was also all afloat. The people had been saying, a little before I got home, that should I chance to be on the path, it would be near 50 days before I could pass the neighboring deep swamps, for, on account of the levelness of the land, the waters contiguous to the Chickasaw are usually in winter so long in emptying, before the swamps become passable. As I had the misfortune to lose my tomahawk, and wet all the punk in my shot pouch by swimming the waters, I could not strike fire for the space of 3 days, and it rained extremely hard. Near the Muskogee country, on my way to the Chickasaw, I met my old friends, Pa Yamadaha, the Chickasaw head war chieftain, and Mingo Pushkush, the great Red Shoe's brother, journeying to Charlestown, with one of the bows of the SPHYNX company, to relate the loss of the most part of that great cargo they so unwisely carried at once, and to solicit for a further supply. Those traders, one excepted, were very indiscreet, proud, and stubborn. They strove who could outdress, or most vilify the other even before the Indians, who were surprised, as they never heard the French to degrade one another. The haughty plan they laid, against the repeated persuasions of the other, was the cause of all their losses. They first lost the affection of the free, and equally proud Choctaw, for they fixed as an invariable rule, to keep them at a proper distance, as they termed it, whereas I, according to the frequent, sharp, upbraiding language of the familiar savages to them, sat and smoked with the headmen on bear skins, set the young people to their various diversions, and then viewed them with pleasure. Notwithstanding the bad treatment I had received, as I was apprehensive of the difficulties they would necessarily be exposed to, on account of their ignorance and haughtiness, I wrote to them, by a few Chickasaw warriors, truly informing them of the temper of the Indians, and the difficulties they would probably be exposed to, from the policy of the French at Tumbip, and that though I had purposed to set off for South Carolina, I would postpone going so soon, if they were of my opinion, that Mr. J.C.L., who joined with me in the letter, and I could be of any service to their mercantile affairs. They received our well-intended epistle, and were so polite as to order their black interpreters to bid our red couriers tell us they thanked us for our friendly offer, but did not stand in need of our assistance. They walked according to the weak crooked rule they had received below, and fared accordingly, for the $2 $1 get savages took most part of the tempting cargo. At this time, the French had only 2 towns and a half in their interest, and they were so wavering that they could not rely on their friendship, much less on their ability of resisting the combined power of the rest of the nation, and they were on the very point of removing that useful and commanding garrison Tumbip, and settling one on another eastern branch of the river, called Potagahatch. in order to decoy many of the Choctaws to settle there by degrees and intercept the English traders on their way up from our settlements. This was as wise a plan as could possibly have been concerted under the difficult circumstances they labored at that time. But the unjust and unwise measures of the governor of South Carolina in sending his favorite traders with a scarecrow of beeswax to keep off others who were more intelligent gave the desponding French a favorable opportunity to exert their powers and regain the lost affections of a considerable number of our red allies, for none of our traders had now any goods in the Choctaw country, nor were likely soon to carry any there. Mr. Colbert, the trader I just mentioned, was of a long standing among the Chickasaw, and indefatigable in serving his country, without regarding those dangers that would chill the blood of a great many others, and he was perfect master of the Indian language. About a year after this period, he went to Red Shoes Town, and in a summer's night, when he was chatting with our great English friend alongside of his Chickasaw wife, a party of the corrupt savages that had been sent by the French shot him through the shoulder, and her dead on the spot. Red Shoes afterwards fared the same fate by one of his own countrymen for the sake of a French reward, while he was escorting the foresaid gallant trader and others from the Chickasaw to his own country. He had the misfortune to be taken very sick on the path, and to lie apart from the camp, according to their usual custom. A Judas, tempted by the high reward of the French for killing him, officiously pretended to take great care of him. While Red Shoes kept his face toward him, the barbarian had such feelings of awe and pity that he had not power to perpetrate his wicked design, but when he turned his back, then he gave the fatal shot. In a moment the wretch ran off, and though the whole camp were out in an instant, to a considerable breadth, he evaded their pursuit by darting himself like a snake into a deep crevice of the earth. The old trader, who was shot through the shoulder, going 2 years after the death of this our brave red friend, unfortunately, a quarter of a mile into the woods, from the spacious clearing of the Chickasaw country, while all the men were on their winter hunt, and having only a tomahawk in his hand, the cowardly French Indians attacked him by surprise, shot him dead, and carried his scalp to Tumbek Fort, another white man unarmed, but out of the circle they had suddenly formed, ran for his firearms, but he and the traders came too late to overtake the bloodhounds. In this manner fell those 2 valuable brave men, by hands that would have trembled to attack them on an equality. The French having drawn off some towns from the National Confederacy, and corrupted them, they began to show themselves in their proper colors, and publicly offered rewards for our scalps. Of this I was soon informed by 2 Choctaw runners, and in a few days' time I sent them back well pleased. I desired them to inform their headmen that about the time those days I had marked down to them were elapsed, I would be in their towns with a cargo, and dispose of it in the way of the French, as they were so earnest in stealing the English people. I charged them with a long relation of everything I thought might be conducive to the main point in view, which was the continuance of a fair open trade with a free people, who by treaty were become allies of Great Britain, not subjects, as our public records often wrongly term them, but people of one fire. As only merit in war exploits, and flowing language and oratory, gives any of them the least preference above the rest, they can form no other idea of kings and subjects than that of tyrants domineering over base slaves. Of course, their various dialects have no names for such. I left the Chickasaw, and arrived in the Choctaw country before the expiration of the broken days, or time we had appointed, with a considerable cargo. By the intended monopoly of our great beloved man, in frightening the Chickasaw traders, there were no English goods in the nation when I went, and the necessity of the times requiring a liberal distribution, according to my former message, that alone must have fallen heavy upon me under the public faith, without any additional expenses. A day before I got there, Mingo Pushkush, the half-brother of Red Shoes, was returned home from Charlestown, and by him I had the honor of receiving a friendly and polite letter from the governor. His main aim, at this sickened time of Indian trade, was to recover the value of the goods that had been lost in the Choctaw country. He recommended one of the traders of the SPHYNX Company to my patronage, pressing me to assist him as far as I possibly could, and likewise to endeavor to storm Tumbek Fort, promising at the same time to become answerable to me for all my reasonable charges in that affair. I complied with every title of the gentleman's request, as far as I could, without charging him for it in the least. As I had then the greatest part of my cargo on hand, I lent the other what he stood in need of, that he might regain what his former pride and folly had occasioned to be lost. At that time, powder and ball were so very scarce that I could have sold to the Choctaw as much as would have produced 1,500 buckskins, yet the exigency was so pressing, I gave them the chief part of my ammunition, though as sparingly as I could, for the French by our pursuit of wrong measures, already mentioned, and their own policy, had dipped them into a civil war. As I had then no call to sacrifice my private interest for the emolument of the public, without indemnity, so I was not willing to suspect another breach of public faith. Red Shoe's brother came up freighted with plenty of courtly promises, and for his own security he was not backward in relating them to his brethren, otherwise they would have killed both him and me, which would have reconciled them to the French, who a few days before had proposed our massacre by a long formal message to them, as they afterwards informed me. I plainly saw their minds were unfixed, for their civil war proved very sharp. Mingo Pushkush and several headmen conducted me from town to the crowd of the 7 lower towns, which lie next to New Orleans, but they took proper care to make our stages short enough that I might have the honor to converse with all their beloved men and chief warriors, and have the favor to give them plenty of presents in return for so great an obligation. The Indian headmen deem it a trifle to go hundreds of miles on such a gladsome errand, and very few of them are slow in honoring the traders with a visit and a long, rapid, poetic speech. They will come several miles to dispose of a deer skin. When I arrived at the thick settlement of these lower towns, I began to imagine they had opened a communication with their subterranean brethren of Nanya. I was honored with the company of a greater number of red chiefs of war and old beloved men than probably ever appeared in imperial Rome. They in a very friendly manner tied plenty of bead garters around my neck, arms, and legs, and decorated me a la mode America. I did myself the honor to fit them out with silver arm plates, gorgets, wristplates, earbobs, etc., etc., which they kindly received, and protested they would never part with them for the sake of the giver. However, by all my persuasions, they would not undertake to storm Tumbek Fort, though I offered to accompany them, and put them in a sure by the avarice and madness of those I have styled the SPHYNX Company. At this dangerous time, the smallpox also was by some unknown means conveyed into the Choctaw country from below, and it depopulated them as much as the Civil War had done. The Choctaw who escorted me into the Choctaw Nation were infected with that malady in the woods, and soon spread it among others, these, a little time after, among the Muskogee, who were in company with me on our way to Charlestown. I unluckily had the honor to receive from the governor another polite letter, dated September 17th, anno 1749, citing me, under the great seal of the province, to come down with a party of Indians, as I had given His Excellency notice of their desire of paying a friendly visit to South Carolina. And having purchased and redeemed 3 French captives which the Chickasaw had taken in war, under their leader Pyamataha, I now bestowed them on him, to enable him to make a flourishing entrance into Charlestown, after the manner of their American triumphs. He was very kind to them, though their manners were as savage as his own, excepting a few beads they used to count, with a small silver cross fastened to the top of them. They had nothing to distinguish them, and were ignorant of every point of Christianity. I set off with above 20 warriors, and a few women, along with the aforesaid war leader, for Charlestown. As the French kept a watchful eye on my conduct, and the commanding officers of Tumbek garrison in the Choctaw and the Alabama in the Muskogee country kept a continual communication with each other, the former equipped a party of their Choctaw to retake the French captives by force, if we did not previously deliver them to a French party of the Muskogee, who were sent by the latter as in the name of the whole nation, though falsely, to terrify us into a compliance. We had to pass through the Muskogee country in our way to the British settlements, and though the French were at a great distance, yet they planned their schemes with consummate wisdom, for the 2 companies met at the time appointed, from 2 opposite courses of about 150 miles apart, on the most difficult pass from Charlestown to the Mississippi, where the path ran through a swamp of 10 miles, between high mountains, which were impassable in any other place for a great distance on. either side. Here, the Muskogee left the Choctaw Company and met us within half a day's march of their advantageous camping place. The foremost of our party had almost fired on those Muskogee who were ahead of the rest, but as soon as they saw their white emblems of peace, they forbore, and we joined company. As soon as I heard them tell their errand, I sent out 3 warriors to reconnoiter the place, lest we should unawares be surrounded by another party of them, but there was no ambuscade. The Muskogee leader was called by the traders the lieutenant, and had been a steady friend to their interest, till by our usual mismanagement in Indian affairs, he became entirely devoted to the French. His behavior was confident, and his address artful. The Red Ambassador spoke much of the kindly disposition of the French to such of his countrymen as were poor, and of their generous protection to the whole, contrasted with the ambitious views of the English, who were not content with their deerskins and beaver, but coveted their lands. He said, the Muskogee were sorry and surprised that their old friends the Chickasaw, in concert with a mad Englishman, should seduce their warriors to join with them to spill the blood of their French beloved friends, when they were by national consent, only to revenge crying blood against the Aquapa, and that the former would be ashamed to allow the latter to carry those captives, who were their friends, through their nation to Charlestown. But, said he, as the Muskogee are desirous always to shake hands with the Chickasaw, the headmen have sent me in their name, to request you Payamataha and other beloved warriors, to deliver to me those unfortunate prisoners, as a full proof you are desirous of tying fast the old friend knot, which you have loosed in some measure. In this manner, the Red Ambassador of the dangerous Alabama French captain flourished away and waited for a favorable answer, according to the confident hopes his employer had taught him to entertain, by the strong motive of self-interest. But though the daring Chickasaw leader, and each of us, according to custom, were silent during the recital of the disagreeable harangue, only by stern-speaking countenances, Payamataha replied, O you Muskogee corrupted chieftain, who are degenerated so low as to become a strong-mouthed friend of the French, whose tongues are known of a long time, to be forked like those of the dangerous snakes, your speech has run through my ears, like the noise of a threatening high wind, which attacks the traveler as soon as he climbs to the top of a rugged steep mountain, though as he came along, the air was scarcely favorable enough for him to breathe in. You speak highly in praise of the French, and so do the baser sort of the Choctaw, because every year they receive presents to make their lying mouths strong. That empty-sounding kettle, fastened at the top of your bundle alongside of you, I know to be French, and a true picture both of their messages and methods of sending them. The other things it contains, I guess, are of the same fork-tongued family, for if your speech had come from your own heart, it must have been straighter. What can be more crooked than it now is? Though I have no occasion to make any reply to your unjust complaints against the English people, as their chieftain, my friend, has his ears open, and can easily confute all you said against his people and himself, yet to prevent any needless delay on our day's march, I shall give as full an answer to your speech, as the short time we can stay here will allow. Since the time the English first shake hands with you, have not they always held you fast by the arm, close to their heart, contrary to the good liking of your favorite French? And had they not helped you with a constant supply of everything you stood in need of, in what manner could you have lived at home? Besides, how could you have secured your land from being spoiled by the many friendly red people of the French, issuing from the cold north? Only for their brotherly help, the artful and covetous French, by the weight of presents and the skill of their forked tongues, would before now have set you to war against each other, in the very same manner they have done by the Choctaw, and when by long and sharp struggles you had greatly weakened yourselves, they by the assistance of their northern red friends would have served you in the very same manner. Their lying mouths, from their own guilty hearts, have taught you so unjustly and shamefully to repeat of the English. You have openly acknowledged your base ingratitude to your best and old steady friends, who, I believe, could damage you as much as they have befriended you, if you provoke them to it. Allowing the speech you have uttered with your mouth to be true, that you are sent by all the red chieftains of your Muskogee people, were your hearts so weak as to imagine it could any way frighten the Chickasaw? Ye well know, the ugly yellow French have proved most bitter enemies to us, ever since we disappointed them in their spiteful design of enslaving and murdering our poor, defenseless, and inoffensive red brethren, the Natchez, on the banks of the Meshisheep waterpath. Ye may love them, if it seems good to your hearts, your example that way shall have no weight with us. We are born and bred in a state of war with them, and though we have lost the greater part of our people, chiefly through the mean spirit of their red hirelings, who were continually stealing our people for the sake of a reward, yet they feelingly know we beat them, and their employers, in every public engagement. We are the same people, and we shall certainly live and die, in such a manner as not to sully the ancient character of our warlike forefathers. As the French constantly employed their red people in acts of enmity against our English traders, as well as us, my beloved friend, standing there before you, complained of it to the Galanomingo in Charlestown, the governor of South Carolina, and he gave him Holbo Variso Paraska Oratupa, their method of expressing our provincial seal, for Holbo signifies a picture, Horiso marked, or painted, Paraska made bread of, and Oratupa beloved, or of high note or power, in my. Warriors gladly shaked hands with his speech, and so did those of your own country, who assured us they always scorned to be servants to the crafty lying French. At their own desire, our old beloved men crowned them warriors in the most public and solemn manner. They were free either to shut or open their ears to the English beloved speech. And why should we not be as free to go to war against our old enemies as you are against yours? We are your friends by treaty, but we scorn a mean compliance to any demand that would cast a disgrace on our national character. You have no right to demand of me those ugly French prisoners. We took them in war, at the risk of blood, and at home in our national council, we firmly agreed not to part with any of them in a tame manner till we got to Charlestown. If the Muskogee are as desirous as we to continue to hold each other firmly by the hand, we shall never lose the friend knot. We believe such a tie is equally profitable to each of us, and hope to continue it to the latest times. When the French ambassador found he must fail in his chief aim, he with a very submissive tone requested the Chickasaw war leader to give him a token whereby he might get the other captives who were left at home, but as they usually deny with modesty, he told him he could not advise him to take the trouble to go there, as he believed the headman had kept them behind on purpose that they should be burnt at the stake, if any mischance befell him and his warriors before they returned home on account of his French prisoners. Finding that his threats and entreaties both proved ineffectual, he was obliged to acquiesce. Testified. The lurking place was as artfully chosen as a wolf could have fixed on his den. When our friendly Indians came to our camp, it was too late to give chase, they only viewed their tracks. At night, the Chickasaw war leader gave out a very enlivening war speech, well adapted to the circumstances of time and place, and each of us lay in the woodland form of a war camp. As we were on our guard, the enemy did not think it consistent with their safety to attack us. Ambuscading is their favorite plan of operation. The next day, by agreement, the Indians led the van, and I brought up the rear with the French prisoners. A short way from our camp, there were steep rocks, very difficult for loaded horses to rear and ascend. Most of them had the good fortune to get safe up, but some which I escorted tumbled backwards. This detained us so long that the van gained near 3 miles upon us. I posted myself on the top of one of the rocks as a sentinel to prevent our being surprised by the Choctaw, and discovered them crawling on the ground behind trees, a considerable way off, on the side of a steep mountain opposite to us. I immediately put up the war whoop and told a young man with me the occasion of it, but he, being fatigued and vexed with his sharp exercise on account of the horses, only cursed them and said we were warriors and would fight them if they durst come near enough. As I was cool, I helped and hastened him off. In the meanwhile, I cautioned the captives against attempting to fly to the enemy in case they attacked us, as their lives should certainly pay for it, and they promised they would not. We at last set off, and met with no interruption, the enemy having a sharp dread of our party ahead, who would have soon ran back to our assistance had they attacked us. About an hour after our company, we got to camp. The Choctaw at night came down from the mountains, and creeped after us. Our camp was pitched on very convenient ground, and as they could not surprise us, they only viewed at a proper distance, and retired. But they used an artful stratagem to draw some of us into their treacherous snares, for they stole one of the bell horses, and led it away to a place near their den, which was about a mile below us, in a thicket of reeds, where the creek formed a semicircle. This horse was a favorite with the gallant and active young man I had escorted the day before to camp. As he was of a cheerful and happy temper, the people were much surprised to find him at night peevish and querulous, contrary to every part of his past conduct, and though he delighted in arms, and carried them constantly when he went from camp, yet he went out without any this night, though I pressed him to take them. In less than an hour, he returned safe, but confused and dejected. When he sat down, he drooped his head on his hands, which were placed on his knees, and said, the enemy were lurking, and that we should soon be attacked, and some of us killed. As I pitied the state of his mind, I only told him that yesterday he and I knew the French savages were watching to take an advantage of us, but for his satisfaction I would take a sweep on foot, while the Choctaw painted themselves, according to their war custom when they expect to engage an enemy. I went out with my gun, pouch, and belt pistols, and within 200 yards of the camp, discovered the enemy's tracks. They had passed over a boggy place of the creek upon an old hurricane tree. I proceeded with the utmost caution, posting myself now and then behind large trees, and looking out sharply lest I should fall into an ambuscade, which the Choctaw are cunning artists in forming. In this manner, I marched for 3/4 of an hour, and then took to high ground, a little above the enemy's camp, in order to return for help to attack them. But the aforesaid brave youth, led on by his ill genius, at this time mounted a fiery horse, which soon ran into the ambuscade, where they shot him with a bullet in his breast, and another entered a little below the heart. The horse wheeled round in an instant, and sprung off, but in pitching over a large fallen tree, the unfortunate rider, by reason of his mortal wounds, fell off, a victim to the barbarians. One of them soon struck a tomahawk into his head, just between his eyes, and jerked off a piece of scalp about the bigness of $1. They took also his Indian breeches, and an handkerchief he had on his head, and immediately flew through a thicket of briars, to secure their retreat. When they fired their 2 guns, I immediately gave the shrill war whoop, which was resounded by one of the Choctaw that had been out a-hunting from the camp. They instantly set off full speed, naked, except their Indian breeches and moccasins. I put myself in the same flying trim on the enemy's firing. We soon came to the tragical spot, but without stopping, we took their tracks, gave chase, and continued it a great way. Unluckily, as we were running down a steep hill, they discovered us from the top of another, and soon dispersed themselves, by which means, not being able to discover one track of those foxes on the hard hilly ground, we were obliged to give over the chase, and return to camp. We buried our friend, by fixing in a regular manner a large pile of great logs for the corpse, with big tough saplings bent over it, and on each side, thrust deep into the ground, to secure it from the wild beasts. Though the whole camp at first imagined the enemy had killed me and captivated the other, yet the warriors did not show the least emotion of gladness, nor even my favorite friend, the war leader, when they first saw me safe, but the women received me with tears of joy. I mention this to shew the force of education and habit. Those who are used to scenes of war and blood become obdurate and are lost to all the tender feelings of nature, while they, whose employment it is to mourn for their dead, are susceptible of the tender impressions they were originally endued with by deity. As the French frequently had been great sufferers by the Choctaw, ever since the year 1730, necessity obliged them to bear their losses with patience, till they could get them revenged by the friendly hands of their red mercenaries. As soon as they had ingratiated themselves into the affections of all those Indians who were incorporated among the Muskogee, and had settled them near the Alabama garrison, and other towns, besides headmen, and sundry parts of the nation, being devoted to their service, they imagined they had now interest enough to get several of those warriors killed, who had joined the Choctaw against their people over the Mississippi. But the old headmen of the Muskogee convened together, and agreed to send a peremptory message to the French, ordering them, forthwith, to desist from their bloody politics, otherwise, the river should carry their blood down to Mobile, and tell that garrison, their own treachery was the sole occasion of it, by mischievously endeavoring to foment a civil war between them, as they boasted they had done among the foolish Choctaw. With much regret they laid aside their scheme, and were forced openly to wipe away the memory of everything which had before given them offense, and to include all indiscriminately in the treaty of friendship, as all had only one fire. This proved a mortifying stroke to the French on sundry accounts, and during the continuance of this distracted scene, if any British governor of capacity and public spirit had properly exerted himself, they must have withdrawn to Mobile, without any possibility of ever returning. For the enmity would soon have advanced to a most implacable hatred, as in the case of the Chickasaw and French, but such a conduct was incompatible with the private views of some among us. As the smallpox broke out in our camp, when we got nigh to the Muskogee country, and detained the Indians there till they recovered, I set off without them for Charlestown. By the benefit of the air, and their drinking a strong decoction of hot roots, they all recovered. A Choctaw warrior of Yashatown humorously told me afterwards that ukahome, the bitter waters, meaning spirituous liquors, cured some people, while it killed others. He, by the advice of one of the English traders, administered it in pretty good doses to 7 of his children in the smallpox, which kept out the corrupt humor, and in a short time perfectly cured each of them, he said, without the least appearance of any dangerous symptoms, whereas the disorder proved very mortal to the young people in the neighborhood, who pursued a different course of physic. As most of the Indian traders are devotees of Bacchus, their materia medica consists of spirituous liquors, compounded with strong herbs and roots, of which they commonly have a good knowledge, and I have observed those who have left off the trade, and reside in the British settlements, to give their negroes for an antivenereal, a large dose of old Jamaica and qualified mercury mixed together, which, they say, the blacks cheerfully drink, without making a wry face, contrary to their usage with every other kind of physic, and it is affirmed that by this prescription they soon get well. The smallpox with which the upper towns of the Muskogee were infected was of the confluent sort, and it would have greatly depopulated them if the officious advice of some among us of all the other towns to cut off every kind of communication with them on the penalty of death to any delinquent had not been given and pursued. They accordingly posted sentinels at proper places, with strict orders to kill such as the most dangerous of all enemies, and these cautious measures produced the desired effect. And by the main mediation of several of our principal traders, joined with the interest of their red friends, the commandant of the Alabama fort prevailed at last on the Chickasaw chieftain to take the 3 French prisoners to him, as he would pay him to his own satisfaction, give him presents, and drink with him as a friend, who had buried the bloody tomahawk deep in the ground. They were delivered up, and by that means the French were enabled to discourage those Muskogee warriors who had joined the Chickasaw. They chanced to be born in the same corner of the world with themselves. The Chickasaw had a very ungracious audience. On account of the excessive modesty of this warlike people, the chieftain gave out a short oration, without hinting in the most distant manner at any difficulties they underwent, by reason of their strong attachment to the British Americans, concluding that as the English beloved men were endowed with a surprising gift of expressing a great deal in few words, long speeches would be troublesome to them. He intended to have spoken afterwards of the Choctaw affairs, and that I was a great sufferer by them, without any just retribution, and accordingly was very desirous of a second public interview, but our cunning beloved man artfully declined it, though they stayed as late as the middle of April. It was a custom with the colony of South Carolina towards those Indians who came on a friendly visit, to allow them now and then a tolerable quantity of spirituous liquors, to cheer their hearts after their long journey, but, if I am not mistaken, those I accompanied had not a drop, except at my cost. And when the governor gave them, at the entrance of the council chamber, some trifling presents, he hurried them off with such an air as vexed them to the heart, which was aggravated by his earnestly pointing at a noted war leader, and myself, with an angry countenance, swearing that Indian had been lately down from Savannah, and received presents. They had so much spirit that they would not on any account have accepted his presents, but for my persuasions. As for myself, I could not forbear saying, honor compelled me as solemnly to declare that his assertion was not true, and that I had often given more to the Choctaw at one time than he had ever given to the Chickasaw, in order to rivet their enmity against the French of Louisiana, and thereby open a lasting trade with them, from which I was unfairly excluded on account of a friendly monopoly granted by him for a certain end to mere strangers. My words seemed to lie pretty sharp upon him, and I suppose contributed not a little to the uncourtly leave he took of our gallant and faithful old friends. Soon after, at the request of the governor and council, however, I accompanied them the first day's march. On their way home from Charlestown, they had no public order of credit for their needful traveling charges, though I solicited His Excellency and the council to grant them one, according to the ancient, hospitable, and wise custom of South Carolina, to all Indians who paid them a friendly visit, whose journey was far shorter, were often uninvited, and of much less service than the Chickasaw to the British interest. As their horses were very poor, I told the governor they could travel only at a slow pace, and as the wild game was scarce in our settlements, hunger and resentment for their unkind usage would probably tempt them to kill the planter's stock, which might produce bad consequences and ought to be cautiously guarded against, but I was an unfortunate solicitor. With a flow of contrary passions, I took my leave of our gallant Chickasaw friends. I viewed them with a tender eye, and revolved in my mind the fatigues, difficulties, and dangers they had cheerfully undergone, to testify the intense affection they bore to the British Americans, with the ill treatment they had received from our chief magistrate, on account of his own disappointments, and sharp-felt censures, for some supposed mismanagement or illicit measures in trade. He is reported to have been no way churlish to several of the dastardly Choctaw, notwithstanding his unprecedented and unkind treatment of our warlike Chickasaw, 200 of which would attack 500 of the others, and defeat them with little loss. Their martial bravery has often testified this against enemies even of a greater spirit. Not long after the Chickasaw returned homeward, I advertised in the weekly paper that as I intended to leave Charlestown in a short time, I was ready and willing to answer any of the legislative bodies such questions as they might be pleased to propose to me concerning our Indian affairs before the expiration of such a time, and that if His Excellency desired my attendance, and either notified it in writing, or by a proper officer, I might be found at my old lodgings. On the evening of the very last day I had proposed to stay, he sent me a peremptory written order to attend that night, on public business, concerning Indian affairs. I punctually obeyed, with respect to both time and place. He was now in a dilemma, by reason of his supposed self-interested conduct concerning the Choctaw trade, which occasioned the aforesaid modest reply, that arraigned his proceedings with severity and plainness. As I came down with the Indians, and was detained by His Excellency, under the great seal of the province, till this period, April 1750, I had just reason to expect that good faith would have been kept with me, that I should have been paid according to promise, at least for all the goods I gave the Indians, by virtue thereof, and have had a just compensation for the great expenses I was at in serving the government, but except the trifling sum of £4 sterling, when I was setting off for the Indian country, I never received 1 farthing of the public money for my very expensive, faithful, and difficult services. In most of our American colonies, there yet remain a few of the natives, who formerly inhabited those extensive countries, and as they were friendly to us, and serviceable to our interests, the wisdom and virtue of our legislatures secured them from being injured by the neighboring nations. The French strictly pursued the same method, deeming such to be more useful than any others on alarming occasions. We called them parched corn Indians, because they chiefly use it for bread, are civilized, and live mostly by planting. As they had no connection with the Indian nations, and were desirous of living peaceably under the British protection, none could have any just plea to kill or enslave them. But the grasping plan of the French required those dangerous scout parties, as they termed them, to be removed out of the way, and the dormant conduct of the South Carolina chief gave them an opportunity to effect that part of their design, though timely notice, even years before, had been given by the Cherokee traders, that the French priests were poisoning the minds of those Indians against us, who live among the Appalachian Mountains, and were endeavoring to reconcile them to all the various nations of the Mississippi and Canada savages, and that there was the greatest probability they would accomplish their dangerous plan, unless we soon took proper measures to prevent it. The informers had ill names and resentment for their news, and the assembly was charged with misspending their time, and taking notice of the wild, incoherent reports of illiterate, obscure persons. But it afterwards appeared that, according to their testimony, the interest and security of South Carolina were in great danger. By the diligence of the French, their Indians entered into a treaty of friendship with the Cherokee, and their country became the rendezvous of the red pupils of the black Jesuits. Hence they ravaged South Carolina, beginning at the frontier weak settlements, and gradually advanced through the country for the space of 8 years, destroying the livestock, insulting, frightening, wounding, and sometimes killing the inhabitants, burning their houses, carrying away their slaves, and committing every kind of devastation, till they proceeded so low as within 30 miles of Charlestown. The sufferers often exhibited their complaints in the most pathetic and public manner, and the whole country felt the ill effects of the late overbearing and negligent conduct. False coloring could serve no longer, and a few inconsiderable parties were sent out, but not finding any enemy, they were in a few months disbanded, and peaceable accounts were again sent home. Our settlement Indians were at this time closely hunted, many were killed, and others carried off. A worthy gentleman, G.H. Esquire, who lived at the Congaree, suffered much on the occasion. He was employed to go to the Cherokee country in quest of valuable minerals, in company with an Indian commissioner. In one of their middle towns, he retook some of our settlement Indians from the Canada savages, whom a little before they had captivated and carried off from South Carolina in triumph. While they were beating the drum, singing, dancing, and pouring the utmost contempt on the English name, honor prompted him to prefer the public credit to his own safety. By the earnest mediation of one of the traders, the headmen of the town consented to be neutral in the affair and act as impartial friends to both parties. He then, with Colonel F.X. and some of the traders, went in a warlike gallant manner, and regardless of the savages' threats, took and brought to a trader's house our captivated friends. They stood all night on their arms, and at a convenient interval supplied those whom they had liberated with necessaries to carry them to our settlements, where their trusty heels soon carried them safe. The gallant behavior of those gentlemen gained the applause of the Cherokee, and each soon returned in safety, without any interruption, to their respective homes, where I wish they had ever after continued. But Mr. G.H., having considerably engaged himself in trade with the Catawba Indians, set off afterwards in company with an half-breed Indian of that nation, the favorite son of Mr. T.B., a famous old trader. In their way to the Catawba, they were intercepted and taken by some of the very savages who had threatened him among the Cherokee when he released our domestic Indians. The government of South Carolina was soon informed of the unhappy affair, and they dispatched a friendly embassy to the lower towns of the Cherokee, requesting them to intercept and retake the prisoners if they passed near their country, and offered a considerable reward. Our friends were carried a little to the northward of the Cherokee Nation, where their language to them proceeded from bodily pains, and from a martial spirit, which they regarded. They consented to carry him on a bier, which they did both with care and tenderness. But on parting with his companion, he refused absolutely to proceed any farther with them, when they tomahawked him, just as his parted friend was out of the hearing of it. The last afterwards got home, and told us this melancholy exit of our worthy and much lamented friend, who died as he lived, always despising life, when it was to be preserved only in a state of slavery. Though he was thus lost to his family and the community, by a manly performance of the duties of his office, in which he engaged by the pressing entreaties of the governor, yet his widow was treated ungenerously and basely, as was Captain J.P. at the Congarees. But there would be no end if we were to enter into particulars of court policy and government honor and gratitude. If our watchmen had not been quite remiss, they would have at least opposed the French emissaries on their first approach to our colonies, and have protected our valuable civilized Indians, for our Negroes were afraid to run away, lest they should fall into their hands. The scheming French knew of what importance they were to us, and therefore they employed their red friends to extirpate them. And while those remote savages of Mississippi and Canada were pretending to seek the revenge of some old grievance, they wounded us at the same time in two very material points, and getting a thorough knowledge of the situation of our most valuable but weak southern colonies, and thus could strike us the deeper, and in destroying such of our inhabitants as were likely to prove the greatest check to their intended future depredations. By our own misconduct, we twice lost the Shawano Indians, who have since proved very hurtful to our colonies in general. When the French employed them to weaken South Carolina, a small company of them were surrounded and taken in a remote house of the lower settlements, and though they ought to have been instantly put to death, in return for their frequent barbarities to our people, yet they were conveyed to prison, confined a considerable time, and then discharged, to the great loss of many innocent lives. For as the Indians reckon imprisonment to be enslaving them, they never forgive such treatment, and as soon as these got clear, they left bloody traces of their vindictive tempers as they passed along. About this time, a large company of French savages came from the headstreams of Monongahela River to the Chirake, and from thence were guided by one of them to where our settlement Indians resided. They went to a small town of the Yuchi, about 12 miles below Savannah Town, and 2 below Silver Bluff, where G.G. Esquire lives, and there watched like wolves, till by the men making a day's hunt, they found an opportunity to kill the women and children. Immediately after which, they scouted off different ways, some through Savannah River, which is about 200 yards broad, and others to the hunting place, both for their own security, and to give the alarm. We had on this occasion a striking instance of the tender affection of the Indian women to their children, for all those who escaped, carried off their little ones. The men, by the alarming signal of the shrill-sounding war cry, soon joined, ran home, and without staying to view the bloody tragedy, instantly took the enemy's tracks, and eagerly gave chase. To avoid the dreaded pursuit, the Chirake guide led the French mercenaries a northern course, as far as the thick woods extended, which was about 15 miles from the place of their murders. From thence they shifted toward the northwest, and were stretching away about 10 miles to the north of Augusta, 496, which lay in a direct line to the lower towns of the Chirake, when unluckily for them, just as they were entering into the open and long-continued pine barren, they were discovered by one of our hunting white men, who was mounted on an excellent white horse, and therefore a fine mark to be shot, which they would have done for their own security, only he outstripped them, and kept in their backtracks, to trace them to their theater of blood. Their posture and countenances plainly told him what they had done on some of our barriers. He had not proceeded far, when he met the enraged Yuchi on the hot pursuit. He told them their course, and that their number was 26. And running about 12 miles farther, they came in sight of the objects of their hatred and rage. Presently, they ran on each side of them, engaged them closely, and killed several. Those who escaped were forced to throw away 9 guns they had taken from some of our people, and almost everything, even their light breeches, to save their lives. They were so exceedingly terrified, lest the enraged pursuers should continue the chase, that they passed wide of our then weak settlement of 96, and kept on day and night, till they got near to their conductor's mountainous country. This was in the beginning of May 1750, and in our Indian trading way, we say that, when the heat of the new year enables the snakes to crawl out of their lurking holes, the savages are equally moved to turn out to do mischief. Many have experimentally felt the truth of this remark. I had at this time occasion to go to the Chirake country, and happened to have a brave, cheerful companion, Mr. H.F. of 96 Settlement. We had taken a hearty draught of punch about 10 miles from Kiowa town, opposite to which the late Fort Prince George stood, and were proceeding along, when we discovered the fresh tracks of Indians in the path, who were gone ahead. As we could not reasonably have the least suspicion of their being enemies, we rode quite carelessly, but they proved to be the above-mentioned Monongahela Indians. Their watchfulness, and our singing, with the noise of our horses' feet, made them hear us before they could possibly see us, when they suddenly posted themselves off the path, behind some trees, just in the valley of 6 Mile Creek, in order to revenge their loss by the Yuchi, which they ascribed to the information of the white man. But their Chirake guide prevented them from attempting it, by telling them that as his country was not at war with us, his life must pay for it, if they chanced to kill either of us, and as we were fresh and well armed, they might be sure we would fight them so successfully, as at least one of us should escape and alarm the towns. With this caution they forbore the hazardous attempt. They squatted, and kept close, therefore, so as we did not see one of them, and we suspected no danger. By the discontinuance of their tracks, we soon knew we had passed them, but, just when we had hidden 2 kegs of rum, about 2 miles from the town, 4 of them appeared, unarmed, stark naked, and torn by the thickets. When we discovered them, we concluded they had been below on mischief. If we had not been so nigh the town, my companion would have fired at them. We went into the town, and the traders there soon informed us of their cowardly design. We went as far as the mid-settlements, and found most of the towns much disaffected to us, and in a fluctuating situation, through the artifice of the French. In a few days, we returned, but found they had blocked up all the trading paths, to prevent our traders from making their escape. Just as we descended a small mountain, and were about to ascend a very steep one, 100 yards before us, which was the first of the Apalache, or Blue Ridge of mountains, a large company of the Lower Town Indians started out from the sloping rocks, on the north side of the path, a little behind us. As they were naked except their breechcloth, were painted red and black, and accoutred every way like enemies, I bid my companion leave the luggage horses and follow me, but as he left his arms at the lower town, and was not accustomed to such surprises, it shocked him, till they ran down upon him. On this I turned back, and stood on my arms, expecting they would have fired upon us. However, they proposed some questions, which I answered, as to where we had been, and were going, and that we were not any of their traders. Had it been otherwise, the dispute would have been dangerous. We got over the mountain, and safe to Timus. Here we rested 2 nights, and found the people distracted for mischief, to which the many causes before mentioned prompted them. The governor, in less than a month after this period, had the strongest confirmation of the ill intention of these savages and their allies. Many expressed with intelligence I sent, but the news was pocketed, and my services traduced, because I would not assist the prime magistrate in a bad cause. He and his humble servants depreciated the long series of public services I had faithfully performed, and called them mere accidental trifles, contrary to his former acknowledgments, both verbal and in writing. The French, however, had a different opinion of my services. They were so well acquainted with the great damages I had done to them, and feared others I might occasion, as to confine me a close prisoner for a fortnight when I went to the Alabama garrison in the Muskogee country. They were fully resolved to have sent me down to Mobile or New Orleans as a capital criminal, to be hanged for having abetted the Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw to shed a torrent of their Christian blood, though I had only retaliated upon them the long train of blood they had years before wantonly spilled. They wanted to have confronted me with the French prisoners I formerly mentioned, and with the long lieutenant, whom we met 2 days before the Choctaw killed one of our people below Bookfara, or the Long Swamp. I was well assured he was to have gone down to be baptized, and so become a good West Florida French Christian, in order to condemn me, the poor bloody heretic. I saw him, and they had by this time taught him to count beads, but I doubted not of being able to extricate myself some way or other. They appointed double pursuit. As they had made my arms prisoners, I allowed them without the least regret to carry down my horses, clothes, etc., and punished them by proxy, in the manner they intended to have served the owner, for his faithful services to his country. While Governor G. presided in South Carolina, it was needless to apply for a payment of the large debt the government owed me, but on his being succeeded by His Excellency W.H.L. Esquire, I imagined this a favorable time to make my address. This worthy patriot had been well informed, by several Indian trading merchants of eminent character, of the expensive, difficult, and faithful services I had cheerfully done my country, to the amount of above £1,000 sterling on the public faith, and of the ungenerous returns I had received. He, according to his natural kindness and humanity, promised to assist me. I then laid my case, with the well-known and important facts, before the members of the House of Assembly in Charlestown, and when they convened, presented a memorial to the legislative body. But several of the country representatives happened to be absent, and as the governor could not be reasonably expected in a short time to purify the infected air which had prevailed in that house for 14 years, a majority of the members had evidently determined not to alleviate my long complaint of grievances. To invalidate its force, they objected that my claim was old, but did not attempt to prove the least tittle of what I exhibited to them to be false. They knew they could not. After a long and warm debate, when my secret enemies observed the clerk of the house was drawing near to the conclusion of my memorial, they seized on a couple of unfortunate monosyllables. I had said that the Indian Choctaw had a great many fine promises. The word fine was put to the torture, as reflecting on the very fine promising gentleman. And in another sentence, I mentioned the time His Excellency, the late Governor of South Carolina, did me the honor to write me a very smooth, artful letter, by virtue of which I went all the way to Charlestown, etc. The word smooth so highly ruffled the smooth tempers of those gentlemen that they carried a vote by a majority, and had it registered, importing that they objected against the indelicacy or impropriety of the language in my memorial, but not against the merit of its contents. The minute I here in a more public manner record anew, to the lasting honor of the persons who promoted it. The voice of oppressed truth and injured innocence can never be wholly stifled. Lest my memorial should again appear at the public bar of justice, in a less infected time, it was not sent to the office, which indicates that the former art of pocketing was not yet entirely forgotten. Indeed, every state suffers more or less from some malign influence, one time or other, but I have the happiness to say that the infection was not universal. South Carolina has always been blessed with steady patriots, even in the most corrupt times, and may she abound with firm pillars of the Constitution, according to our Magna Carta Americana, as in the present trying era of blessed memory, so long as the heavenly rays shall beam upon us. As the power and happiness of Great Britain greatly depends on the prosperity of her American colonies, and the heart-soundness of her civil and ecclesiastical rulers, and as the welfare of America hangs on the balance of a proper intercourse with their Indian neighbors, and can never be continued but by observing and enforcing on both sides a strict adherence to treaties supporting public faith, and allowing only a sufficient number of such faithful and capable subjects to deal with them as may gain their affections, and prove sentinels for the public security, I presume that the above relations and observations, instead of being thought to be foreign, will be deemed essential to an history of the Indians. The remarks may be conducive also to the public welfare. Ignorance or self-interest has hitherto wrongly informed the community of the true situation of our Indian affairs westward.
If you've been to this channel more than once, please subscribe, as it truly does help the channel. Leave a comment, for the Bang looks forward to reading them and replying to them. Also, don't forget to like and share this content with like-minded individuals such as yourself. There is plenty more where this came from. Until next time, this Bang content will end in 3, 2, 1.